In the middle of a genre-spanning tome exploring the origins of hypercapitalism and its eventual stranglehold on American culture, only to find yourself wanting to throttle one of the primary antagonists due to his absolute appalling lack of empathy? Then grab the throttle of the inconvenience and steer into thrilling action and adventure with the newest book featuring everyone's favorite high-flying sextet, The Chums of Chance Face the Fourth Wall. A story set within a story, a novel concept that. We find our brave adventurers facing the threat the likes of which none have come across before. Miles, Darby, Chick, Lindsay, Randolph, and of course Pugnax are pitted against the one thing they've been avoiding their entire lives, their very own existence. Are they truly true heroes, tasked with saving a world that can't seem to get out of its own path of self-destruction? Or are they merely pawns in a writer's fantasy world, devoid of agency and free will? Can they find the ability to transcend one and become another? Or are they forever buried between the pages of a denser work, destined to act merely as tone breakers when preceding chapters have proven to be too bleak? Will our boys find a way to break through the frame of the narrative and escape their predetermined fates? Or are they barreling towards an ending meant only to tie together plot threads in which they have no known connection? What even is the meaning of their existence if they have no say in their own paths? Can they rely on the mystical powers of bilocation via Icelandic spar to shift them into a world in which they have control of their fates? Will Pugnax get another flank of beef? The answers may lie in their newest adventure novel, or they may be contained entirely within the world of Against the Day. They may even be explored in this week's episode of Mapping Zone. Wait a minute. I'm reading this for the show. What does that make me? Am I real? Or am I the narrator from the novel? Which novel? What show? If Mapping the Zone is real, I must be. But I didn't write this. So does that make me not real? Who wrote this? The same person who writes the other ads? Are they real? Why are there ads on a show for things that don't exist? What is the point of that? What's the point of me reading all of this? Who does this benefit? Hello and welcome to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. This week we are going to be going through Against the Day, chapters 22 and 23. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts here.
I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And this week, Cody had some family obligations, so it is just going to be the three of us, but he should be back next week, no problem. As I have previously mentioned, the chapters we are discussing are going to be 22 and 23. Luke, do you have a summary for us of these?
Chapter 22. We rejoin Deuce and Sloat. They are in a shotgun shack discussing what to do with their day. The two decide to head into Telluride, where they split ways for a few hours, only to reconvene their friendship at the Non-Parai Eating House, a restaurant run by Mava and Lake Traverse. Lake waits tables while Mava does the cooking. So Lake is the one who first encounters the pair. Deuce sizes Lake up, realizes who she is, and the three of them engage in some verbal repartee until Mava calls Lake back to the kitchen, where she warns her daughter about Deuce and Sloat without seeming to know about their role in Webb's demise. Fast forward through some lovey-dovey stuff, and we read about another of Lake's admirers, Willis, a doctor at a nearby hospital. Then the narration moves back to its focus on Deuce and Lake's budding romance. Eventually, he begs her to marry him and even agrees to celibacy until marriage. But Maba takes work off one day and her replacement, Oleander Prudge, loudly confronts Lake about Deuce's role in her father's death. Lake replies by pointing out that she does not feel the same way about Deuce as she does about Webb. Mava and Lake finally have a conversation about Deuce that does not go the way Mava wants it to, as she is so convinced that Lake is making her look like a fool by marrying Deuce that she does not think it matters whether or not she spends the night at the train station in preparation for leaving her daughter behind forever. When Sloat finds out, he was just as confounded as I was when I first read this book, though nothing can stop the couple who get married in yet another memorable wedding scene from Pynchon. However, it also proves true that nothing can stop Deuce and Sloat from ditching Lake for a week and returning only to laugh hysterically at an inside joke. Once Sloat moves in with the happy couple, the reality of Lake's situation sets in. Deuce wants to share her with Sloat, a desire that Lake acquiesces to, and the three eventually form a throuple. A few sex scenes and niggling details later, Deuce is being interrogated by a mining company bigwig because at least one Kieselgirl kid copycat has sprung up. The tension is broken once the bigwig mentions Deuce's recent marriage. Deuce tries to attack him and is only stopped by the drawing of a pair of pistols. Warning signs begin to appear all around Deuce, and things get so bad that he feels he has to tell his wife that dangerous people are likely after him. Indeed, word arrives that a gang of retirees armed with antique weaponry have been hired to kill him. He becomes paranoid and begins imagining that Sloat must have also met with representatives from the mining company and sold them out. So Sloat heads off in a vaguely southern direction. Deuce watches him go and is thereafter plagued by insomnia. He experiences so little sleep that he sees a ghost one night. And then chapter 23. Following his father's burial in the mountains of Colorado, Frank Traverse gathers up his things and moves to Denver, which I have done not once but twice. There, despite trying out a number of disguises, middle managers from the Vibe Corporation keep approaching him and feeling him out for possible employment, though Frank still looks into the details of his father's death, despite all of that. And the more he explores, the greater his sense that the Vibe Corporation had ordered Webb's death. Indeed, the Vibe Corporation's reach is such that Frank soon stops being interested in jobs related to silver and gold to instead focus on zinc. Lucky him, as there is a zinc rush on. Such is his success, he is the time to become embroiled in a romance with one Ren Provenance, who compares the technical details of zinc mining to alchemy. On a date at a saloon, they verbally explore ancient mysteries for a while before Ren goads Frank into joining her at a brothel called Jenny Rogers' House of Mirrors. This still exists. Jenny Rogers' House of Mirrors still exists. And when I first heard of it for the first time a decade or so ago, I said, "Who the fuck is Jenny Rogers and why the fuck does she have a House of Mirrors?" Glory days, glory days. Frank is dragged away by fame and finesse, and later, following a surely joyous interval, rejoins Ren, who seems to be on drugs. Ren confesses to feeling like everyday bourgeois sexuality is now boring for her. Then we delve into Ren's backstory. Just like I was forever changed, derogatory, by what happened at the Four Corners last chapter, Ren has returned from that same area after searching for Ostalon, a chapter of her life that seems to have been her personal Vietnam. Yes, she is still haunted by what her team uncovered while digging and exploring, as the terrible history they uncovered seems to have saturated the entire area with its maleficence. Maleficence. Later, Frank and Ren are at a bar on 17th Street. There, a local crime reporter tells Frank that he might want to consider going back to the mountains, as all is not right with his family. Reef has been looking downtrodden, and Frank has not heard from the women in his family for a while. Plus, his father's killers have put out word that they want to see him. He invites Ren to come along, but she politely declines. Knowing that what lies ahead of Frank will likely require him to be sober and vigilant, they decide to relax and drink as much as they want.
All right, thank you for that. I do not envy the task of needing to summarize what is most of the first chapter of these two that we're going to be covering. That must have been not particularly easy.
Yeah. It was one of the more it's probably the most difficult summary to write that I've had to do so far. So
Yeah. I also wanted to start off before we just get into like all three of our individual impressions of the chapters by asking you how these chapters felt as someone who's pretty familiar with Colorado, because there's a lot of Colorado in the in these two chapters particularly. Um, it feels like to a higher degree than previous times that the book has kind of jumped through different towns or places there. So as someone who lived there for a while and kind of has a lot of history with it, how do these chapters feel compared to your experiences?
yeah, I mean, one thing I was thinking about this week is that Pynchon does seem pretty determined in this book to mention a lot of mountain towns that are in areas of the Colorado, like Western Colorado, that are not super touristy these days. Like, like Breckenridge hasn't come up, I don't think. Aspen hasn't come up. Other towns like that haven't come up, but all of these kind of random and like Leadville, I think does get a little bit of tourists. Tourist, like it does have some touristy aspects. I haven't spent an incredible amount of time up in the mountains because I don't. I there's never like a winter or like a mountain sport that I ever got into. Uh, and a lot of these places that he mentions are kind of places that are more like if you live in Colorado and have a lot of free time and you're really into mountain sports, you've probably been to these places just because they have like trails and different stuff. But yeah, it does read as from what I know about Colorado, it reads as very authentic, like usual with Pynchon. Um, some of the history in these chapters, I was taught about in school. I believe I think it was like in eighth grade, so that's like over 20 years ago. So it's not like I have a large amount of like retention, but some of it just kind of rang a bell. Mm. Yeah, I mean, as usual with Pynchon. I mean, like I said, he does seem to capture Colorado pretty well.
Nice. And I guess sort of as an easy transition point, how do you feel about these chapters in general?
So the lake induced romance is very frustrating. It's just not, you know, you just don't hear about people doing that kind of stuff. It's just out of my wheelhouse, I guess. I don't just it just sits wrong with me in like my stomach, basically. That being said, like I was kind of annoyed by how well it's written. Um, I Pynchon is constantly kind of surprising me. I do read other stuff uh in between record like like I'm not just reading against the like one chapter or two chapters but against the day over and over between the 2 weeks between recording and Pynchon's writing is can be kind of singular in a lot of ways, especially in Against the Day. I feel like where there's a lot of I'm not reading other stuff that's very similar to him. So I constantly am kind of like I really love the prose in these two chapters, but just a lot of it annoys me. Like a lot of the plot annoys me.
Yeah, understandable. It is pretty difficult. And I think you're right in that like there is a sense of frustration in how well that is written. And in turn sort of the feeling that it causes you to have like really deep in the pit of your stomach. And I think that of course that is all purposeful, right? Like it's supposed to be revolting and it's supposed to make you feel that way. And he's just very effective at accomplishing that. Um, and it is. I'll be curious if you guys, once we get into that content specifically, have any theories or thoughts thematically of what it is that he's doing there. Um, there was a post on the Thomas Pynchon subreddit that I came across that kind of analyzes Lake's existence within a framework similar to Lilith that I think is interesting, and I can share sort of the insights of that particular person. But certainly the thematic ideal in it, there's part of me that really felt like, okay, maybe this does add something to her character in like a very broad based sense, but I did not necessarily feel like it was necessary um to the book itself. It certainly isn't the only time that Pynchon has written stuff that is sexually explicit. that crops up in a lot of his books. But it is maybe one of the first times where I thought, I don't know how well this undergirds the actual thematic intent of the book itself, and the explicitness of it certainly I felt like did not. But it's also entirely possible that I missed something, so I'll be curious what you guys think. So a lot of that first chapter that we're going to go through is pretty tough in that regard, and then the chapter that follows I enjoyed a lot more, just from the perspective of getting to see how the different tendrils of the Vibe Corporation continue to work, and getting to see what is some like tender romance. It's pretty fleeting, but in certainly in contrast to what comes before in the first chapter, there is like a real innocence that is portrayed between that kind of not exactly relationship, but kind of relationship that we read about between the two of them, and then um, it gives a good amount of momentum towards the end of that chapter, towards kind of the next phase of the Webb family storyline inherent within Against the Day. So I had a good reading experience, certainly, especially in contrast to the Italy chapter, which was just like filled with research and filled with things to kind of break apart in your mind and to consider in the larger, sort of context of the book. This was also just a nice break in terms of the amount of research that one has to do, or if you are someone who is really invested in that research, what you may feel compelled to do. So it is another example of a case where Pynchon gives you some big heavy lifting in one chapter and then kind of gives you a lighter experience going into the very next period of what you're going to be reading. So yeah, those are my thoughts on these chapters. What about you, Will?
I feel very much the same. I mean, it's it's a difficult the first chapter here, 22, is really difficult to work with, if you ask me. But I don't know. I feel like I've started to come around to a reading that is not just kind of I don't know, just salacious, I guess.
Sure.
Because unfortunately, that is all I got from it my first time through this book, which not a pleasant facet. But yeah, anyway, um, the actual language though that it's discussed through, like both of y'all said, is really clear in kind of an impressive way for Pynchon, especially coming you know we just got back from doing our sprint through Shadow Ticket, and the mode of writing in that is so much more obscure than it is in these chapters,
Mhm.
which is interesting because it's not like the language isn't incredibly dense. Um, it's interesting because it's not one of those chapters where nothing much is happening and you're getting a lot of scenic description. Or neither of these chapters are like that. You're not getting a lot of scenic descriptions. You're not getting a lot of like tone setting. Instead, you're getting a lot of really fast-paced details one after another that I wouldn't say quite overwhelm you, but definitely uh, I don't know, it makes it intense in a way, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty cool, and I like that use of language that this book is full of. Um, and I hate to say it, but I think that Pynchon tends to with some of his most disturbing sections. He's written like effective erotica in these
Yeah.
horrible scenes.
Yeah. Similar to Bleeding Edge. Yeah.
Yeah, similar to Bleeding Edge, similar even to some of the worst stuff. It's a skill he has to make people see the appeal of horrible things, and that is
Mhm.
not great. But whatever. And the thing is, just to be clear, I've known a few people who live a life that is much less psychologically screwed up than what's going on with like Lake and Sloat and Deuce. But the mechanics are very similar, and those people, there's nothing gross about that. It's entirely the motivations and the attitudes that are gross about those scenes, if you ask me.
Yeah. Yeah.
and then the next chapter with Frank, Frank's a great character, and Ren is really interesting. I don't think we get to see her too much more, but she's a fun character to kind of stop by for a while, and just kind of the relationship between her and Frank ends up being kind of like a weird obverse of the other relationship in the previous chapter, where instead of like what seems to be a very passionate, very committed, very real relationship between at least Deuce and Lake, regardless of how you feel about the activities or the notions they're in. It's for all the wrong reasons. It's commitment and it's passion, but it's not from like a place of connection, I guess. It almost feels like. Whereas between Frank and Ren, there's no future for them, and there doesn't seem to be an expectation of any kind of real romance, but they are just, essentially pals who get along well and like to hang out. And so it's almost like, one couple is like the termination of horrible decisions that is like fatal in both ways. And the other is this, passing two ships in the night kind of nothing important is going on except for, human relation. And that's neat.
Yeah, agreed. So getting into this first chapter, it does, of course, start out with Deuce and Sloat, where it turns out that they have sort of just decided to go right back to business as usual, even in the same town, even though, to a rational mindset, there might be reasons to avoid that area for a while. But when you're doing stuff underneath the auspices of the Mine Owners Association, you probably can be a bit more brazen. That brazenness does, however, land them inside. First, there's a mention of the Cosmopolitan Saloon, which was a real saloon in Telluride, Colorado, that was sort of notable for being a higher end establishment. It was really frequented not so much by miners, but by lawyers and business owners and mine like officials, people who worked for the owners association, or even like the owners themselves. The menu, there's someone on the Pitch on Wiki that was able to pull a reference to like what their menu had on it, which had fine old California wines and champagnes, for example. So again, higher end for the time frame. There were also photos that you can find of just, it seems well appointed. A lot of artwork on the inside. It seems clean, and there's a lot of sort of wood and metal work in the bar and in the sort of appointments of the saloon itself that really make it seem like it's well tended and well taken care of, which would have certainly been in contrast to a lot of the establishments that probably Deuce and Sloat have been to, and that people within the actual mine workers would have frequented. So it's interesting that Pinchon starts out with them being in this more higher end establishment, and then the two of them immediately start talking about going and visiting prostitutes and just getting out of there. I think that especially in context of kind of what we've talked about with the recent One Battle After Another episodes, and then we had a listener write in a quote from Vineland about Brock Von forever sort of not fitting in with the crowd he was hoping to. Pinchon seems to almost be doing a very similar thing here by choosing a very specific establishment. And so the two of them leave the Cosmopolitan, and they eventually end up at the Nonpareil Eating House, which happens to be where both Lake and Maeva are working. And the description of this place I really, really love. It comes from page 261. Close to dawn, Deuce came lurching into the Nonpareil Eating House, Sloat walking shotgun right over his shoulder. The place was full of hungry drunks, drovers with imperfectly developed social skills chased among the tables after saloon girls who were not too tired to move as fast as they had to. The place was full of lard smoke. Maeva was in and out of the kitchen, cooking and working whatever tables Lake wasn't. Both women kept up a level of determined bustling, as if allowed the 1,000 details of the day to fill up what otherwise would have been some insupportable vacuum. Deuce took this for female restlessness, which he thought he understood. When Lake came over to inquire with a silent lift of the eyebrows and chin if they were there to eat or sit, he did not remark at the same time how desirable she looked. What just surprised him was the way she kept some fire in her eye, rare in a biscuit shooter that no long shift was about to put out. Later, he would also become aware of a darkness just as indelible that could not be, but maybe was, the strain of some undivulged sin. And then the two of them begin to flirt after this. And this is about when I read the dialogue back and forth between them, where I went, oh no, oh please no. Because as someone who has not read this book, I did not know that this was a part of the plot. I certainly did not know that this was going to be like a good chunk of this chapter. But I do know enough of Pynchon's other work that when he starts writing dialogue like that, or starts introducing characters to one another in this way, that usually there is some sort of romantic, or at the very least sexual kind of follow-up to that. And certainly that is what we start to get. After this meeting, there is a series of conversations over the course of not just that one page on 261, but also 262 and 263 and 264 of multiple people warning Lake about what it is that she's doing. Either warning her in the sense that they know who Deuce is, and that this is just a bad guy, without maybe necessarily knowing what he has done to Lake's father specifically. And then, of course, there are some who suspect what it is that he has done to Lake's father, and then there are some who seem to know perfectly well what it is that he's done. And so it is really a not protracted, but pretty fully explored dynamic of one of these women in Pynchon's novels getting drawn towards a source of evil or a source of corruption in some way. And it is this sort of weird, indelible need or desire that she has. So much so that on 262, it literally says, what was it exactly that had started into ringing so inside Lake, tolling bone deep, invisible in the night? Was it the way his face that morning, even with the smoke in the room, had slowly emerged into clarity? Like an old memory, older than herself, something that happened before that she knew now she'd have to go through again? And the way he was looking at her, a knowing look, worse than the most cocksure good-for-nothing that ever came her way. The assumptions being made, not just by him either, but by something outside them, had to be an altitude. So even from within the narration, it is making very clear that whatever it is that there is psychically going on that is drawing her towards him, you can't name it. You can't necessarily put a face to it. It's indelible. And of course, these sections, before it gets into the very just explicit sex, are really effective in their writing. That first paragraph that I just read on 262, I have the rest of the page highlighted because all of it is just very, very effective and is very, very evocative of emotion that you don't want to feel, but is being communicated in a way that really makes you understand kind of what it's like to be in those shoes of falling in love with somebody. Maybe not with someone who you should be repulsed by, but it is the same feeling or the same desire in a lot of cases when you're indelibly drawn towards somebody, especially if they're actually right for you. You don't always necessarily know what it is. You just know that it's something that is sort of pulling you along. And so really the question that I have for you guys before we get into kind of their courtship, as much as you can call it that, and then marriage, is, do you have any thoughts on this engagement between the two of them? Do you have any thoughts on how it's written? What exactly is your feeling or disposition towards this relationship? That's sort of question one, and then we'll go on once they actually sort of consummate their relationship.
What I'll say is, I don't think you're wrong at all to say that it's not the kind of thing that can be explicated. But I will say, I think that the passages that you highlighted kind of right around what's kind of going on here, like subconsciously with the characters. And I don't look. Some essentially psychoanalysis of non-existent characters here.
Yeah.
But so the next paragraph after what you read out loud, the first line is, as for Deuce, of course he knew who she was. She had the man's face, for Christ's sake. And so kind of that contextualizes the way his face that morning, even with the smoke in the room, had emerged into clarity and was looking at her with a knowing look. What you got to remember is how much Lake resents her father, even as he's dead. She might not necessarily, as much as she said it previously, be glad that the man's dead. And maybe she is, who knows. But I doubt that for reasons we'll get into later. But it seems likely that what they might have kind of connected over in that instant was a mutual hatred that like was transmitted essentially through Deuce recognizing Webb's face, immediately being put off kilter, and her finding the disgust or the loathing or the apprehension in his face just particularly resonant with her general kind of attitude, because she, through this whole book past her early childhood, has been a very spiteful person. And I don't say that judgmentally. Some people just thrive on spite. And she's one of them. And so for her to have this guy who has been clearly described as more or less handsome, he's not necessarily the best looking guy in Colorado, but he's not nothing. Comes in and he looks at her with recognition and looks at her with, as I said, not a cocksure not a cocksure expression, but a certain like, oh, I know who you are. Look, I know what you are. Look, and that's a lot of sentiment in a face, and like recognition is one of those things that is very tangible. At least if you ask me, in someone's face. So like, I could see it being as simple at this point as she is like 20, maybe a little younger, a little older, do they say?
I don't think so.
Yeah. But she's, 19, 21, that range. And that's the age where people really start, and it's not necessarily like an instinctual thing, I'm not going to use that language. People start getting that urge to settle down, right? It might not necessarily be to settle down in a particular sort of family arrangement, but generally the idea of like more interest in committed relationships. And so I can see that being the sum total of what starts off from Lake's perspective. Sure.
Yeah. And I guess I should clarify when I'm talking about the like indelibility of not understanding. I mean from Lake's perspective, like she probably doesn't fully understand what that drive is.
Sure.
But I think you're right. I think that what Oleander Prudge, the Dickensian character that walks in for just a few minutes in this novel, mostly by name only, brings up is pretty apt with kind of also what you're talking about. That there is a knowing from Deuce's perspective, and that maybe the last time she experienced that was from the kind of confrontation with her father, where he saw through kind of her lie about how she'd been spending her time. And of course, in one instance, that led to her getting kicked out. And there's some real sadness in that. But I do think that what you're talking about also does undergird that for sure. Luke, any thoughts on these early portions of their relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't think about, whenever I was reading this, the fact that during this time period, like an 18 to 22-year-old woman would be expected to be courting and with the expectation of marriage, by the time she's 22, 23, 24, I would imagine. which does kind of help explain things. So thank you, Will. Honestly, as for my own thoughts, I just don't like thinking about this whole thing in general. Like I said, I mean, if my sister were to do this, I would, I would. I'm not saying I'd down like her husband and the other guy and kill them or something like something crazy like that. But I would be quite angry, quite annoyed, confused probably as well. Maybe I'm kind of empathizing too much with the brothers or something. But it just kind of confounds me. I mean, I do like that we don't ever get like we don't get a whole lot of interiority from Lake.
Mhm.
Not that Pynchon does a lot of interiority in general, but so we never get the moment whenever Lake fully realizes that Deuce is her father's killer. That epiphany or that realization doesn't seem to happen on the page, where it seems to happen off page, like off, outside the text, which is an interesting, like authorial choice. I mean, it could happen whenever Oleander, or not Oleander, what's her name? Oleander. It
Oleander
could happen,
Prudge.
when Oleander Prudge tells her, but that doesn't seem to be the case. That's the first she's hearing about it. From the way the Lake responds, doesn't give me that. It like doesn't tell me that she's just now realizing that. If that makes sense. But yeah, just in general, I just I just don't like thinking about it, to be honest.
Yeah.
It just annoys me. And not like in like I'm not like mad at Pynchon or thinking that these chapters are bad or anything. It's just not. I'm not even saying it makes me uncomfortable. Even it's just I just don't like. It just rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, no, and like I kind of said at the beginning of the episode, I struggle with the idea that this is necessary for the novel, you know, and that this is doing something to reinforce themes or other sort of plots that Pynchon is exploring. It doesn't feel like a requirement for that work, and so certainly from the perspective of what you're talking about, the kind of annoyance of its presence, that is reinforced or made all the worse by the fact that for me, I struggle to see why it's there in the first place. Um, and Will, you had kind of briefly mentioned that you had some thoughts on why it might be there, or that you had some considerations on subsequent reads beyond just sort of the sordidness of it all. Did you want to go into that now, or did you want to wait a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is as good a time as any, I guess.
Sure.
I mean, we'll have to talk about it a little bit past this, but yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
so what I think an important line here in that conversation with Oleander Prudge is how I feel about Mr. Kindred trying for some school teacher's enunciation. Not that it's your concern, and how I felt about Web Traverse are two different things. And that harkens back to what Lake was ostracized from her family for, right?
Mhm.
She was kicked out because she wasn't believed, um, and because of misogyny and all that good stuff, and for parental overbearing protection, and in a similar way, Oleander is kind of affording the same role here without the parental authority. She's saying you're doing something wrong because parents, because it's not done, and she's saying, yeah, but inside of me, these are two different things, and you can't tell me how I feel.
Right.
And I kind of think that's where this all boils down to. Like, she clearly falls head over heels for Deuce. Like, there are multiple paragraphs that all but say that in the previous spread of pages, and
Yeah.
she's not being like led by so to speak, Freudian urges. She's saying we're not gonna sleep together until after the wedding. This is not a fling for her. She likes this man for some reason,
Mhm.
or at least thinks she does. And so, in a sense, sentiments in a way that some people might think is a crass use of character, but I don't really care. Um, she kind of symbolizes the entirety of the very early feminist movement, just in her sentiments, not in her actions at all. But what that leads to is kind of a laying bare of how sentiments, even the most liberatory sentiments, can be something which drives people further into what's the word I'm looking for? It's not coming to me, but just despair and feeling trapped. And so she is like, and Pat, I'm gonna move forward in this a little bit, or in the chapter a little bit, just to support what I'm saying. Like
go for it.
She is like, at a certain point, she has already made her stance to the public around her. I am with this guy who all of y'all are saying killed my father, and I don't care what you say. And Maeva comes into it, and it's kind of the same deal. If she cows to what Maeva's telling her, then she is in like a deeply, like, in a motivational sense, like psychologically, she is saying, well, then I should have let I should not have spat on his grave.
Yeah. Yep.
And all of those things would be her announcing who she is, because she is all of those things, whether they're things she's proud of or not. And it has to, especially like just based on the fact that, like, it's described as love that grows to the same strength as its loathing, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She clearly is not in this because she loves this man and wants to be with this man and really likes being around him and likes the life that she envisions with him. It's clearly, to some extent, a degree of, like, self-flagellation, whether or not it's conscious or whether or not it's like the primary motivation. But that feels like it's kind of the last bit of the ratchet mechanism that prevents her from questioning her earlier choices.
Yeah. I appreciate you laying it out like that, and I think that what you have described is a kind of non-esoteric way of deconstructing this relationship. This analysis that I found on the Thomas Pynchon subreddit kind of takes a lot of those same ideas that you're articulating and puts them in an esoteric or a mythological context. So I just wanted to read this to you guys because I think it's got some good stuff in it, and I think that it lends some more weight and meaning to this relationship. I don't know if it initially moves me to the point where I think that this is necessary for Against the Day. I feel, and so I think that while the writing here is good, and the stuff you've just mentioned and the stuff that I'm about to read does lend an air of interest to it, I still feel like this book functions probably without it, of course, without having read the entirety of it. But this comes from a user on Reddit named My Gender is Krona, with underscores in between each word. This post is just called Analysis of Lake Traverse and Against the Day. And it reads as follows. Lake doesn't get a lot of love in Against the Day, but she deserves so much more. So let's talk about her. I finished her first chapter where she falls for Deuce on my third read, and it hit me that she might be some sort of Lilithian illusion. Obviously, Pynchon pulls from many myths and cultural conceptions, but I think this is clearly one of them. A. Lilith is associated with wind, darkness, and the night. Lake is a prostitute, sometimes they're called night walkers, and in general, her character refracted using many motifs of darkness and night. Her chapters are significantly more hued in a nocturnal atmosphere than her brothers. Lake desires to, quote, become the wind, from page 267, after Webb casts her out of his family, referring to her as a, quote, child of the storm, from page 190, making wind a significant motif of her character. B. Lake is commonly associated with birds as well, which are also a prime motif in the Lilith myth. C. Lilith is commonly associated with loneliness, sorrow, and loss, which are pervasive themes of Lake's character. D. Everything about the Lake, Webb, and Deuce plotline has some pretty clear Genesis text. Lilith, in the most accepted versions of the mythology, was cast out of the Garden of Eden and left to dwell in exile in the desert. This occurs because Lilith refused to lay beneath Adam during sex. She believed they were created equal, both from the dust of the earth, thus she should not have had to lay beneath him. After Adam disagreed, Lilith fled the Garden of Eden to gain her independence. I probably shouldn't have to spell out the parallels there, especially considering the Oedipal sexual desire Lake has for Deuce, who comes to represent a reflection of her father. Lake is born of the world and exemplifies a freedom that Webb could not look upon. He feared it because in this, quote, young female spirit, page 190, he sees a power that is much older, more truly free than his idea of freedom. Webb wanted to be a wild man. He loved the strive for freedom more than his family. He sold his soul for it and abandoned his kin for this ideal of being free. But in his daughter, he sees a power older than his own, one that he can't understand and thus cannot control. Webb, through his abuse and neglect of his family, recreates the systems of masculine power and domination that are such a fixation in Gravity's rainbow. He is one example of a father you can't quite manage to kill. Remember how immersed he is in the usage of dynamite, which intrudes upon the sacred mountains and the sacred land, page 929. And in a sort of inversion of Gravity's rainbow, it leaves him unable to stand what his daughter represents. So he curses her to literally become a child of the storm, of the winds, and, quote, move forever in motion over the broken land, unquote. Go back and read the scene where he curses her on page 190. He repeats himself twice, like he's saying an incantation, to let it sink in and ensure whatever cosmological powers exist in this world know he means it. This could easily be interpreted as Adam casting Lilith from the garden. This would not be one-to-one if Webb were her only father, but through Deuce, that aforementioned Oedipal aspect is awakened. Like I said, Pynchon is never just pulling from one myth or reference at a time, so it becomes a plausible explanation. And let's not forget Deuce is often portrayed through Eden motifs as well. He is called the Deceiver in the chapter where he kills Webb. He is commonly symbolized with snakes and serpents, page 475, etc. This reflects not only Satan, but Samael, who coupled with Lilith after her expulsion from Eden. There is more to the cast out to the desert aspect as well. Reading on an article on biblicalarchaeology.org concerning Lilith, I found something interesting, and I will highlight the most fascinating bit. This comes from that website. Quote, dating from the 7th or 8th century BCE is a limestone wall plaque discovered in Arslan Tash, Syria in 1933, which contains a horrific mention of Lilith. The tablet probably hung in the house of a pregnant woman and served as an amulet against Lilith, who was believed to be lurking at the door and figuratively blocking the light. One translation reads, quote, "O you who fly in the darkened rooms, be off with you this instant. This instant, Lilith, thief, breaker of bones," unquote. Presumably, if Lilith saw her name written on the plaque, she would fear recognition and quickly depart. The plaque thus offered protection from Lilith's evil intentions toward a mother or child, unquote. Metafiction and the character's literal place within the universes of this novel are huge in the book, which is the key to examining the novel's characters and cosmology. After Lake is cast out by both Webb and Maeva and falls in love with her father's killer, she is exiled down out of the mountains, quote unquote, page 472, and becomes folded that quickly into the family of legend, quote unquote, page 473. Lake is also unable to have a child, just as Lilith was cursed with the endless death of her offspring in some iterations of the legend. One possibility is that Lake becomes, as Skip the Lightning says in part 1, sort of gathered back into it all, page 74, and becomes a representative of nature, the wind, lakes, water, and darkness. This would explain how she is cast to the margins of the story. She is literally marginalized, quote, refined to an edge, an invisible edge of unknown length, unquote, page 267. This is also what happens to Webb after he dies and becomes a restless spirit, further paralleling Lake with her father. Like her father, she is a specter haunting the entire Travers plotline. Her presence, quote, moving forever in motion over the broken land, unquote, and existing all around her brother's stories, even if she is mostly invisible. She is literally the wind, the water, and the storm. Go back and read the chapter where Kit and Hassan pass through the Prophet's Gate, page 768. It is in these places where her implicit presence resides. The desolate, lonely deserts of the world, cast up by men to the margins of history. It is possible her dispersal over the narrative, only appearing at the end after all lines, quote unquote, of history are singled up, is a Slothrop-esque scattering of her character's place in the story, but of course in a different sense. It is important to note that I don't think Pynchon is demonizing Lake, despite literally modeling her after a mythic demon in one sense. Remember that the entire novel routinely rejects binaries, and no one concept is ever completely good or completely bad. When, for example, Tace condemns Lake for standing between her brothers and their revenge, this might not actually be a bad thing, seeing as how much of a stain on their souls the revenge quest is. Her story is the tragedy of how the natural human desire of pure freedom is polluted and beaten into subservience by the evils of the power structures that make up the male-dominated industrial society, one that poisons and destroys nature. Lake is a median of the Travers plotline, and she is absolutely a key character in Against the Day despite her relative lack of page time compared to the rest of her family. I do believe Pynchon can only go so far to portray this sort of story, and I would not blame or even disagree with the idea that the sexual aspects of her character are misogynistic and gratuitous, and I think she would have benefited from just 1 or 2 more POV chapters. However, I do think it's clear Lake is the biggest victim in the story, one who was most primed to truly be against the day, but what she learned as a result of her abuse and imposed role led her to restructuring and reinforcing the dominating power structures. Literally, she is freedom in nature being caught in a chokehold by the men, and her story is ultimately a tragedy, her lost potential absolutely meant to be mourned. One other thing, another name for Lilith is literally Lilake, and that for me pretty much settles it right there. There's also stuff I want to explore about the concept of Shekinah and the High Priestess Tarot card, which I believe refracts Lake as well, but those are explored later in the novel, so we'll see how I feel about that as I go along. I'm by no means a mythology or history buff, so please feel free to correct me on anything wrong. However, I love Lake and find her to be an immensely underrated character by design, so I hope this one possible angle is interesting to some people. End of analysis from this person. So I think certainly you and this person, Will, are working in a similar territory. There is a feminist angle to this character in that she is searching for a kind of freedom, or at the very least, a kind of agency over her actions that lead her to become in conflict with Webb and her family, and then ultimately is used against her by greater structures, that she can maybe imagine at the time. So I guess how does that analysis scan to you guys? Because I found it very insightful and very interesting. Obviously, there's some stuff in there from later in the book that I don't have the full sort of connections to. So I especially wanted to ask 2 people who have read it before what they maybe thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, that was like scholarly level analysis that you read out. I mean,
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. I do agree that Lake could be a bigger character and that, she could be less sexualized, definitely. Even with, the reason that she's thrown out of her family is, for making some money. It's never I guess it is pretty much revealed that how she made that money, but Webb doesn't know that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did really enjoy that Reddit post. I'm not sure I read it whenever it came out or whatever, but I really enjoyed listening to it.
Regarding the analysis, I think my understanding of the Lilith myth is vestigial at best. That's not quite the right word, but it's not a great understanding. But that checks out to me. It makes a lot of sense. Like you said, Kate, it lines up with a lot of my own thoughts. I would like to add a few notes. Do we actually have any confirmation that Webb's assertions are true? We have
her prostitution.
Yes.
No. In fact, this chapter you could read as being in direct opposition to it.
I do think that in that chapter, I think she goes. It said that she goes back to to making money that way. There is because she does do later in that chapter. Maybe not start, but is what I'm saying is go back to being a prostitute. I think there is some language about returning to the job.
Yeah, so I found that paragraph. It's on 191. It I can read it out. I don't think it needs to go into the episode, but I don't know. It says, "I'm so bad," she kept telling herself, but couldn't believe it till she was in Silverton again, where a bad girl could find her own true self, like coming home to a real family. just a little grid of streets set in a green flat below the mountain peaks. But for wickedness, it was one of the great metropolises of the fallen earth. Jitter and Jesus. 60 or 70 saloons and 20 parlor houses just on Blair Street alone. Drinking, gambling, fucking 24 hours a day. Repeal what? Repeal. Smoking opium with the Chinamen who came and did the girls' laundry. Handled by foreign visitors from far across the sea with dangerous tastes, as well as domestic child corrupters, wife cripplers, murderers, Republicans. Hard to say which of them her or Rika had less sense about who she went upstairs with. Somehow they glided through the nights as if under supernatural protection, learned not to let their eyes meet, because they always started laughing. And some customers got violent about that. Sometimes they woke up in the little jailhouse and heard the usual from sheriff's wife with an ineradicable frown. It went on till winter began to make itself felt, and the prospect of snow up to the eaves got all the ladies in line making those seasonal readjustments. So yeah, it's like, it is just ambiguous enough that if you really wanted to read the line in this chapter on a page, was it
267, she was a virgin bride.
Thank you. Yep, exactly. You could argue that perhaps using the logic of the times, perhaps she had only been doing sodomy,
Sure.
Yeah, in a modern sense at all. But yeah. In any case, I think there is it's one of those things where I get the sense that Pynchon is trying to be very clever, I guess, in a way that I don't think is beyond criticism at all, because I don't like it either. But like, she had her slight features pressed into her small features pressed into the blood red dirt, facing northeast southwest, and all of that is like, if you really want to dig into symbolism, like all of the sexual stuff is incredibly dense with symbolism. It's just
yeah,
for all the reasons Luke said, it's just unpleasant.
Yeah, it is.
And like, this is going to extend a little bit more of my reading without the mythological framing, but I don't think it's contradictory. I think there's an argument to be had that because we don't see blatant superiority directly, like even less so than other characters, because she is such a, I wouldn't say reactionary, but reactive character, that it seems almost she might be in her own way trying to stop the blood feud that she had told her brothers off from. Mm-hmm. Like, she met this dude and fell head over heels for him, and then through the barrage of people telling her off for it, she built up this logic of, not only would it be to deny herself, to change her behavior based on this, not only would it be to deny her own values, to change her behavior based on that familial shame, but also this is her in kind of the same way as Webb, trying to be an anarchist bomber who is also a family man. This is her trying to be a domestic woman, and in that like very, very Freudian sense, fulfill her father's wishes while still insisting on refusing the spirit of what the new patriarch of her family would wish, And that doesn't tie into the sexuality at all, because the sexuality, I don't think you can read that as anything other than like just like in just things that are supposed to be unpleasantly visceral. Like,
yeah, it is certainly that. Unpleasantly visceral would be a pretty good way to put it.
What do y'all think of the what the part that Will was just talking about with the then rotated all four different ways? There's small features pressed into the dirt, the blood red dirt, because I have seen at least one literary scholar interpret the word blood red to mean she, like, it may have been sexual assault and stuff, and I feel like Lake is pretty clearly consenting, at least up until that point.
As much as she can. You can
Yeah.
certainly read this as coercion over the fact that what she had expected this relationship is going to be ended up not being what it is, and so she's going along with it just to preserve it. But yeah, I agree that to the extent that you could reasonably say that she is consenting to everything. I don't know. I can't say that I thought much of that description when I was reading through this chapter for this episode. That could be as a result of the fact that it was just pretty tough. I was looking forward to when it ended, the kind of montage of unpleasantness. But that is a good question. That is a very evocative description that is not necessarily present in a lot of the other descriptions of the sex that she has with Sloat and with Deuce. You know, so I can't say that I have a specific interpretation, but I'd be curious if either of you guys do.
Well, I do.
Lovely.
So the Four Corners area, the dirt is just blood red. It is disturbingly red. It's beautiful, the landscape, but it is a wasteland, and the dirt is like full of rust. So I wouldn't necessarily read that into implying that she was being sexually assaulted. However, like, again, knowing a lot of people who are into this kind of behavior as though it's a crime.
People who are into this dynamic, maybe.
This dynamic, this kind of kink, whatever you want to call it. You know, blood from your face being rubbed into the ground is far from beyond pale. Pun unintended. But it's also okay. So like that analysis of Lake Traverse from that Redditor that you read from said, Lake is definitely meant to be very connected to nature in a lot of ways. And you know, with the Traverse family, we get a ton of loving scenery of the Mountain West region of America, and there's clearly like something about the Traverse family is not necessarily supposed to be like, and I mean, not necessarily, you know, the Edenic family, although clearly that's there.
Mm-hmm.
But it is in a way, it is like the archetypal. These are good, wholesome people of the earth. Webb is a good guy with his head screwed on straight, except for overbearing paternalism. Maeva's a tough, salt of the earth woman who doesn't stand for no bullshit, except in the case of her overbearing husband. Like it's all very archetypal in that sense. And so Lake being read as like she is the land part of this family. And so what you have literally happening in that scene is the Four Corners area, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. Arizona and New Mexico, major places for the military-industrial complex, and Colorado and Utah, major sites of mining, and plenty of mining in New Mexico as well. And so there's just like this very dense kind of crosshair, as it said, kind of zeroing in on the exploitation of the land and the people as an extension of the land of the Americas happening there. And so the human representation of this spirit of anarchic love of life and relation is being double teamed over the representation of over the like physical markers laid out by the state in order to divvy up the land for exploitation by the people who enact the ultimate form of betrayal against the land by killing this Edenic patriarch.
That's pretty good shit, Will. Not gonna lie.
Yeah, I don't like thinking about this chapter at
Yeah.
all, but I've unfortunately felt like I had to since I read it for the
Yeah.
first time.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
So yeah,
Ugh.
I think you can do that kind of reading with pretty much all of the sex scenes between the three of them. And I'll just say there are this does come to function. This relationship comes to function as a counterpoint for a few others going forward
Okay.
beyond just Frank and Ren. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's a load bearing part, but I do think that Kenshin wanted it to be.
Yeah, that it is serving some greater function.
Exactly.
That's good to hear. So we've kind of jumped forward a little bit from a perspective of the actual sort of outline of the narrative of this chapter, but there's also kind of a way to not do that. Or there's not really a way to not do that, given that all of this stuff is really bound up with one another. But sort of getting back to where we had ended up, we have sort of a final parting between her and her mother. That after she is warned by many people, it finally comes to her mom just being very honest with her and be like, "This is not good." Going so far as to say, like, "You're gonna reap what you sow," and of course, that is exactly what happens to her. She does reap what she sows basically immediately, and she chooses to leave. And this is the case where, like, Maeva, man, like, what a sad character this is, just from a perspective of what has happened to her. She ends up in a relationship with a man who is certainly abusive in a number of different ways, even if he isn't trying to be. And at the very least is neglectful of the family. He gets killed after he expels her, their daughter, the only other woman in this family, from the house. And her youngest is off working for, and she doesn't necessarily know this, but working for the people who engineered the death of her husband. And now her daughter, after being cast out and after them having this brief period of what I assume was probably real happiness, working together and, living in close proximity to one another, leaves that to go marry her husband's killer. Like, how adrift you must feel as a mother and just as a person, um, when this whole situation comes to rest on you. And I hope that there is something for her later in the book, because if she goes through all of this and she leaves Telluride on page 265 by way of a very interesting train, which is actually historically true. For a long time, the trains in Telluride had to go into the station, back out, and keep backing out until it found a place to turn itself around. So for her to go through all of this and then leave Telluride, and then for there to be nothing else for her, no synthesis of her suffering or resolution for everything that she has gone through or experienced, that'd be pretty rough. And I'm not anticipating that being the case, but I'm just thinking about the concept of, if this is it for her character, if she just ends up kind of adrift and alone, more or less betrayed by everybody except for her two oldest sons. That is a tough existence and a tough dissolution of this sort of, like you're talking about, Will, kind of Edenic quality that her family may have had at one point. Her leaving that train, and specifically the way that it backs out, where she is at least symbolically forced to continue looking at what she's leaving behind until the train itself physically turns, was a real gut punch for me reading this chapter, in a way that there has been a lot of with this particular family. But that particular image of her being on that train as it backs out for miles, just allowing her to watch Telluride recede from her vision, was a tough thing for me to swallow.
It's a tear-jerking passage, no doubt.
Yeah, most definitely.
How few possessions she has is also kind of striking. And I do really love the detail that she doesn't care about what people think about her, and she'll just go. spend the night at the train station, which is probably not going to be, you're not going to get much sleep and stuff, and you're out in public and people are going to talk. But she doesn't care, because presumably she's either not coming back or she's already been made such a fool of that, it doesn't matter. Because Maeva is in some ways, I do think she has some pride, still. And at least she's asserting herself and saying that she's, not going to put up with it as much as you wish that conversation, or a reader, and probably she wished that conversation had gone differently, or maybe that the outcome was different. But in my opinion, at least she's not sitting around and enabling Lake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
from her point
true.
of view,
Yeah, and I think you're right in that she does retain some pride. I think it would be more of a dissolution of her pride for her to stick around and just watch that happen. To watch her only daughter effectively be ruined by the killer of her husband. I can't imagine what it would be like to have to bear witness to that in the degree that she would. After this scene, we get Sloat in disagreeing with this arrangement, which this is such a fascinating dynamic between the two of them. The fact that this portion ends or begins with, "This is disgusting," Sloat shaking his head. "I mean, I'm fixing to lose my damn lunch in a minute," is so telling. That, like, even if he, who is just as big of a piece of shit as Deuce is telling him, like, "You gotta stop this, dude." Like, this is so wrong on a number of levels, is a real sort of canary in the coal mine for what this relationship is really going to be. But that warning doesn't have any effect either. The two of them are just, I don't want to say destined to end up with one another, but basically destined to end up with one another. And so on 266, they do get married. I'll ask you guys about their marriage scene in a second here, but there is a line from 266 at the top of this page break where it says, "The snows lengthened down the peaks, and soon the white-throated swift had taken wind. Shooting and head-breaking in town got worse. The military occupation began in November, and then deeper in the winter in January, martial law was declared. The scabs came to work in relative peace. Business was slow for a while in town, but picked up, and Oleander Prudge made her debut as a nymph du pave. Miners who thought they knew what was coming away bewildered, shaking their heads." Now, there's a line here: "The military occupation began in November." This historically sets where we're at in 1903, because this is referring to another strike and series of events that took place as part of the Colorado labor wars. So, as I had talked about in a previous episode about the Colorado labor wars and the formation of the WFM, this is another kind of event that is caught up in all of that. So, workers at an ore processing mill walked out on September 1st, 1903, over a reduction in the workday from 12 hours to 8. Owners made an attempt to reopen with a non-union workforce, but striking members of the WFM pushed out the scabs by intimidation with pistols and rifles and prevented them from entering into the mine proper. By November, the mine owners made several requests for the National Guard in Colorado, seeking protection for the scabs so they could reopen the mines. That request was not honored, but a delegation was sent that included the Attorney General of Colorado at the time. And they showed up, they sort of surveyed the situation that was going on. And they reported that the city was peaceful, that there was no active fighting or anything going on, but that reopening the mines would almost certainly lead to violence. The governor of Colorado asked Teddy Roosevelt to send in the army, and Teddy Roosevelt refused that request. On November 24th, 500 Colorado National Guard, under orders from the governor, arrived after a confrontation between sheriff's deputies and picketers led to the arrest of 5 miners. 6 more were arrested on the day the Guard arrived, including a Union president who was arrested upon visiting the men in jail. So basically, some sheriff's deputies came and like kicked up a fuss, incited some like fighting. They arrested the men who were involved. The next day, they arrest more of them. All 11 of these people are miners in the WFM, so their union rep comes and visits them, and then he gets arrested for nothing. They just threw him in jail. Sheriff's deputies then begin arresting anyone without a job. They charge them with vagrancy. And at this point, the National Guard is kind of hovering over all of this going on, so that the ability for the striking miners to push back or to combat this at all was pretty minimal. And essentially, the way that they were charging people with vagrancy was just, if you don't have a job, you're going to jail. And that allowed them to just walk up to anyone striking, asking if they had a job. And then when they said no, or when they ascertained that they were a striking member of the union, they just took them to jail. This sort of led a lot of striking miners to abandon the strike and just flee Telluride in an effort to get a job elsewhere or just avoid going to jail. And the situation itself got worse because the people who remained kind of pushed up the agitation, pushed up their general retaliation to these events. And 11 union members were then arrested, not for vagrancy, but for intimidation of non-union workers. So at this point, Telluride was kind of becoming a bit of a melting point was being reached, essentially. A boiling point, rather, was being reached. And these charges were dropped pretty soon after they were brought in. But the local authorities decided to release those 11 miners in Montrose, which is 71 miles away from Telluride, effectively just deporting them from the city and from the effective area of influence of the strike. This went on with a couple other groups of miners, but these 11 are sort of considered the most historically important. The National Guard would leave in January 18th specifically, which led to the return of all of these miners that were expelled, at least the ones who wanted to come back. So kind of as soon as the reinforcements that the sheriff's deputies had left, they just decided, okay, well, now we can come back and we can just kick up a fuss again. The local Citizens Alliance, however, upon their return, responded by issuing National Guard rifles to local citizens and instructed them to re-expel the miners. So this is where we're getting into like the martial law point of what Pynchon is talking about. So 78 Union men and their allies would be expelled while the mines continued to operate with non-union labor as a result of this Citizens Alliance that I don't know, I have no clue how the National Guard would have operated in 1903 to where you could just get access to their equipment and their rifles where you just give them to random people. But apparently that was an option. And so the mines just were able to continue operating with non-union labor, and a lot of these expelled miners just went to find jobs or places like in other places, other mines. They moved on to different things, and then eventually things kind of settled into an uneasy sort of peace in the city. This particular aspect of the Colorado labor wars is historically kind of viewed as one of the best explanations of how the Colorado governor and the National Guard at the time were effectively employees of the Mine Owners Association and sort of became a blueprint, or at the very least the best sort of example to point to of how something could look like it was being used to tamp down violence or anger or tensions, but is actually simply being done at the behest of power. And so a lot of, as I kind of mentioned, modern historians will look back at this period, this governor, this National Guard in Colorado, and really just view them as essentially extensions of these mine owners associations. which really puts a lot more impetus on the importance of these labor movements and really puts a lot more weight to their actions when you consider what these miners had against them and what they were actively trying to get for themselves. You know, we kind of look at these as in some circles that maybe have less exposure to this history than other, we kind of look at these movements as like pretty important to the development of a 40-hour work week or an 8-hour work day, or eventually, of course, like the dissolution of child labor and so on and so forth. But maybe we have some difficulties from a modern lens of seeing why violence or bombing was justified. When you get into the details of what they were fighting against and what they were actively working on circumstantially, it was more or less a war. Like speaking about this as a labor war, both of those words are accurate. They're fighting over the rights of employees and of union members, but they are also actively fighting against the government, and in some cases, armed troops from the government, from the National Guard, or the National Guard resources just being given to citizens that disagreed with them. And so this is kind of important context if you're someone who is reading this book or listening to this podcast and hearing about the history behind kind of the development of labor unions and wondering why things like dynamiting or things like sort of violent pushback sort of was seen as necessary. This is the situation that they were put into. This was the situation of what they were fighting against. They were taking on not just a company, but largely, in some cases, the entire sort of government establishment from a municipal and from a state level. So it's important, I think, that Pynchon includes that detail, even though it largely doesn't have much to do with what's happening on the page between Deuce and between Lake, to remind the reader of sort of the backdrop of what's going on and the situation, you know, as a whole, that is really like undergirding why Deuce is even there in the first place, and just how that is a easy sort of identifiable mark of the struggle itself that the miners were facing and of the systems at which power would fight back against them, either just through two guys or through the National Guard. So yeah, that's your historical context for this section that leads off their marriage.
Thank you for that. It also does a lot to provide Pynchon with a reason to once again demonstrate that there is no society. There's only the nuclear family, as as the genius Margaret Thatcher made clear to everyone.
Truly a genius.
I'm curious. Someone's gonna think I'm being serious at some point.
Oh yeah, 100%. Of course, after this, we get into the actual ceremony of their marriage proper. It's written really nicely. It's again, and it's one of these moments, as sort of all three of us have said, where what's actually happening is pretty horrifying, but the way that it is written is really just kind of lovely. Does someone want to read that paragraph starting with Lake and Deuce on page 266?
Lake and Deuce were married over on the other side of the mountains in a prairie church whose steeple was visible for miles, at first nearly the color of the gray sky, in which it figured as little more than a geometric episode, till at closer range the straight line began to break up, soon slipping every which way, like lines of a face seen too close, haggard from the assaults of more winters than anybody still living in the area remembered the full count of, weathered beyond sorrowful, smelling like generations of mummified rodents, built of Engelmann spruce, and receptive to sound as the inside of a parlor piano. Though scarcely music ever came this way, the stray mouth harpist or whistling drifter who did pass through the crooked doors found himself elevated into more grace than the acoustics of his way would have granted him so far.
Yeah, so just it's really nicely written, and I wish it was being applied to a more innocent seeming relationship. We do get some more fun Pynchon alcohol description in that the officiant makes them a punch to celebrate the wedding that Sloat asks what the contents of are, and he says Everclear alcohol, 120 proof, some peach juice, certain Scandinavian ingredients. So we get some fun detail there. And then, of course, there's this paragraph. She was a virgin bride. At the moment of surrendering, she found herself wishing only to become the wind, to feel herself refined to an edge, an invisible edge of unknown length, to enter the realm of air forever in emotion over the broken land, child of the storm. I feel like we've gone over that pretty well earlier in the episode, but before we kind of move on, does anyone have any last thoughts that they want to talk about? Because the next 3 pages are pretty much just sex between Deuce, Sloat, and Lake.
I do think that the virgin bride thing could be like metaphorical, or like, you know, how
Mm-hmm.
some born again Christians will get baptized and then, you know what I'm saying? Or like something like that will get baptized and then be abstinent and stuff. Or like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, at the very least, she did not have sex with Deuce before they were married. So you could
Yeah.
certainly interpret it in that regard as well.
Yeah, and it could even just be a statement on her, how she's feeling in a way.
Yeah, the innocence of her desire or
Yeah.
what she's going into the relationship with. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't have much to add on to it, to what we've already said, except for I do think that the weird middle of the night scene is kind of weirdly adorable.
I had hoped that was going to be the energy given to the whole thing. I knew that it wasn't, but I certainly hoped that the way that depicted their first night as a married couple would maybe just be the whole thing, and it would be a big upending of expectations. Of course, that was just wishful thinking, but I agree with you. There is a cuteness to it.
Yeah, and I do. I think this was totally intended, because like the next section starts with basically Sloat telling her to wake up.
Yep.
Which that's the only other thing I have on this section to say. I just think that's a very clever bit of writing.
Yeah, agreed. What starts to happen is Sloat, Lake, and Deuce all just sort of enter into a throuple, where sex is the main part of that relationship seeming. I do appreciate that at one point she does suggest that the two of them should just fuck each other, and I appreciated that Pinchon put that in there, because the way that the two of them talk about it kind of just makes it seem like they want to. So I'll call that out. But at a certain point, this kind of montage is the word I've used before, and I'll use again. This sort of montage of malfeasance ends, and we get a conversation between Deuce and Sloat where he mentions that this might be his penance, that this kind of fucked up dynamic or relationship that the three of them ended up in is some sort of punishment inherently to him as a result of killing Webb, or of being the kind of person that he is. And this, of course, seamlessly leads us into what his real punishment may end up being, where he is told that there is another anarchist bomber out that is engaging in very similar tactics to what Webb did, and that this could be an example of a job not finished, or at the very least a job that maybe wasn't done at all, and that they got shanghaied in some way in what they initially paid Deuce to do. The Pinchon Wiki does a lot of hand-wringing over the line "bombs by the moon." Do either of you have any thoughts on that? I seemed to just interpret that as that he commits his crimes, so to speak, under cover of darkness or under moonlight. I struggle to see much of relevance beyond that in the statement.
Yeah, I interpreted it as, you know, perhaps him bombing, or the people doing the bombing whenever it's like a full moon or wherever whenever like the moon is brighter than not. I got the same sense of it basically that you did, and I was a bit. It was interesting what the guy with the pension wiki went on about, but I didn't see it in the text.
I agree. I'm not sure there's any reason to read that much into it unless you have like another specific, like more textually based reason to interpret Webb as being like astrologically inclined.
Agreed. From there, Deuce kind of realizes that even though he is under the impression that the job was completed and that there should be no reason for anyone to be unhappy, that he's maybe going to get taken out himself. And this is maybe going to happen if for no other reason than because the company itself wants to cover its own tracks. And the best way to do that is also by getting rid of the guy that you hired to shoot them. And it's a good example of kind of, if we're looking at a lot of this stuff through a capitalist lens as you're supposed to, it's a good example of how a lot of people talk about that there really is no loyalty within a hyper-capitalist framework. Like, you could do everything you could possibly want in service to that company that cuts corners, that maximizes profit, that gets to an end that the company desires, and still, if it affects the bottom line better to have you gone, they are going to do that. There is no degree of loyalty that you can really get to where you're safe from that. And if you're someone who's engaging in murder for hire, that should certainly be evident to you that that if what you're doing is extrajudicial, then they have additional reasons not to keep you around. And so he realizes that he is probably going to have to get moving and making tracks out of here. And this whole kind of I don't want to say happy family, but this whole domestic arrangement that he's found himself into is going to be coming to an end pretty soon. I do think it is interesting that on page 271 he does use the phrase "sufficient unto the day" and so forth, as that is a phrase that Webb says to him on page 96, or at the very least is noted as saying, and probably at some point said to him, that there is still some kind of trace of Webb following him around, no matter where he may go. And this conversation between Lake and him is sad from a definitional perspective, but I am mostly sad that Lake doesn't seem happy that he's going. So it's mostly my stuff that's happened why I sad rather than any kind of tragedy inherent. There is certainly some tragedy to the fact that Deuce is looking at her almost with pity over the fact that in his mind she hasn't figured out who he is yet. But it is there's some good description in it. I really like the line in particular. She was trying to understand, wanted at least to look like she was, but it was beginning to feel like being in a skip that had just slipped its cable, heading for the center of the earth. Been doing something you shouldn't, Deuce? That idea of just sort of having the rug pulled out from under you, and that if you're already in a position where Lake internally doesn't know where the attraction is coming from, and then you get forced into this sort of arrangement by which you are, I want to say abused, but I understand that there is some degree of consent happening here, in which you are being forced into an arrangement that you did not think you were going to end up in, and that her motivation, I think, to stay in that arrangement is just that maybe the idealized version of this relationship she had in her head would stick around or would come about if she just went along, which is sort of a tragedy of women in abusive dynamics and relationships for time immemorial. That to have even that pulled out from under you because he's going to have to skip town, and it's because he killed your dad. Like, this whole thing is just very messy and emotionally devastating in a number of different ways. Like, I'm glad that the two of them are separating, but it's similar to how the section of leaving Telluride comes across. This is very similar. That, like, you have tried so hard to find the freedom that you were looking for, especially going back to what Will said earlier in this episode about the kind of feminist angle of her actions. And it is only leading you to more heartache and more despair. It's got to be tough to be this lady, especially in a era in which the opportunities for women living singly or trying to strike out on their own, if their husband did like skip like this, are pretty slim to none. Her prospects for success in the future at this point is kind of wrapped up with this guy who, at the end of the day, does not care about her as much as he says he does.
Yeah, in like these pioneering towns, there's just enough latitude that she might have been able to keep on going, running, a restaurant of some kind. But she's already moved out of that. She'd have to start from scratch.
Yeah.
What I will say is there's a a little bit of a grandiose tragedy, if you can excise the deuce of it all.
Yeah.
Because this is the tragedy of the professionalization of the hitman. And it's kind of weird how that's kind of what this is exactly, right? Like there's the paranoia at the end of the chapter that goes against that, but at the same time we have martial law has been imposed. That there are both trained militiamen out there and people armed and given the authority to shoot strikers. They don't need people like Deuce anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
It's an honorable career killing your fellow man.
Kind of build off that a little bit. I do think it's interesting just to kind of put yourself back in this time period whenever, without, I would assume that they don't really have, especially in a place like Jeshimon, would have like death certificates or morticians and all that stuff. And I do think that, probably the rise of that kind of stuff, the standardization of that kind of stuff is partially kind of related to this kind of stuff, with having to make sure that somebody really is dead if they are dead and stuff. If you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Where it interests the state and corporations and stuff like that to have that kind of official documentation. I mean, it is somewhat endearing to me that Deuce gets so mad about the implication that, like, he married the guy's daughter, so he might be kind of a softie or something, or have not been too soft to finish the job and stuff. Is one interpretation you can make of that scene. And I don't like Deuce, obviously, but it is somewhat endearing that he at least cares enough to not have his new marriage come into question, and his motives come into question in relation to his new marriage. And there is, I mean, like Deuce does, to kind of go back a little bit. I mean, Deuce does, seem to be celibate before the marriage and stuff, where as bro-y as the language kind of gets in some ways during the throuple, and as like objectifying as that can be, not that Lake seems to not enjoy it, but it is kind of annoying how much you almost want to like Deuce at points in this chapter.
Or at the very least that you want your first impression of him to be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is effective writing in that regard. I do agree. There is additionally a mention of who might be coming after him being ex-Danites. This is... so when I was in seminary, I had a couple of different comparative religions class, and I was known as the Mormon person because whenever I had to write papers about comparative religions or to sort of discuss Christian, quote unquote Christian movements outside of the traditional Christian church, I usually just talked about Mormonism because I just find it so fascinating for a number of reasons, and also distinctly American. There is something about Mormonism as a whole, its history, its sort of ultimate aims and philosophy that feels just very distinctly American, and that it could not have come from anywhere else. And so I did my best in taking notes to not just write a 30-minute long like summary of who the Danites were, because there is a long sordid history of Mormon militias that come out of the church, and that in a lot of cases committed just straight up atrocities in the name of the church. There's more than one massacre, to use a historical definition, in the church's history through its use of these militias. And the Danites kind of represent the beginning of that, at least to a perspective of there being an easily identifiable beginning. Essentially, the Danites began as a wing of enforcement within the Mormon church itself. And what they were trying to do was enforce the laws of the religion, or the strictures of the religion, and make sure that people were adhering to it, is essentially the purpose behind when this began and what they were originally kind of beating the drum about. They actually had it, like, not necessarily a charter, but their sort of rules or justification for existence could be boiled down to this one quote that was given by their initial leader, which was that they would enforce the laws, or they would support. And I'm gonna just take that line again. Their sort of justification for existence could really be boiled down to this one line that comes directly from the first sort of leader of the movement, in as much as it coalesced around one man, in which he said, seeking to enforce the laws of the religion and support the heads of the church in all things they say or do, whether right or wrong, unquote. So that kind of tells you everything you need to know about who these people are to begin with. The idea that, like, regardless of what the leadership of the church does, we're all about it, is pretty insane. However, eventually, as the Mormons started to experience a lot of difficulties in settling in Missouri specifically, and there is, of course, like a weird moralistic bend to this, in that a good amount of the reason why they were having issues in Missouri is because they were abolitionists. The Danites switched from being involved in internal enforcement of church doctrine to being involved in external enforcement of what they saw as safety for the Mormon people, threats to safety or threats to the security of the church. And so once they had kind of switched their aim to defense of the Missouri, Missouri really started to push in a campaign to just get the Mormons out. They out by whatever means necessary. They started by asking nicely and basically just saying, can you move somewhere else? Can you settle in one county instead of multiple? And then eventually it escalated, right? So it escalates in a lot of the similar ways to how some of these labor relations escalate, where a couple of individual people take up arms, or a couple of individual people try to run some Mormons out of town. And then whole municipalities try to run Mormons out of town. And then the state militia maybe has some people involved, or at the very least, local sheriffs and their deputies have some people involved in these operations. And this eventually leads to the governor signing Executive Order 44, which formally expelled Mormons from the state of Missouri. So with Executive Order 44, he basically said, you guys need to leave. And if you don't leave, we're going to force you out. And this led to the sort of a sort of period of history that is often referred to as the Mormon War in Missouri, where skirmishes started to take place between Mormons and between non-Mormons, or people who represented sort of officials in the state, whether that be, again, municipal guard or sheriff's deputies, so on and so forth. And in a lot of these cases where trouble was found to be cropping up, the Danites would send people to protect the Mormons or to fight back. And there was a number of skirmishes that took place. Not a lot of people died from a historical context, but 4 people might die in one of these battles or in one of these fights. that took place, and there was a couple of bigger engagements that would crop up if you read through the whole history. And the sort of fighting and violence reached a point where it was effectively damaging the reputation of the Mormon Church beyond just Missouri. And after one particularly impactful battle that you can read about on Wikipedia and in a lot of different church histories took place, there came to be an understanding that maybe the Danites weren't the greatest thing to have around anymore, and that maybe Mormons just needed to leave and settle somewhere else. That there was really no end in sight to this. So, the leader of the Danites, his name is Samson Avrad, was captured, and the movement officially died a pretty quick death after his capture. However, its members, even though the organization had sort of officially been dissolved and had been their authority had been revoked, the members were all people who were still seen as pretty important. And so a lot of modern historians of the Mormon Church point to the dissolution of the Danites as not even necessarily a move made out of any positive intent, but out of one of like public relations. That the Mormon Church just needed to get rid of this in order to protect themselves. And the biggest thing that they kind of point to is that all of these people who were ranking members of the Danites, who were big deals in that organization, got given huge responsibilities and important posts when the Mormon Church was in Nauvoo, Illinois, and then eventually when they went to Utah. And these people were able to take up significant posts in county law enforcement when they would move to Illinois, or in positions of influence like within the church structure itself. A lot of them also would end up being a part of the militia in Nauvoo and were responsible for the takeover of that city, the expulsion of the natives that had lived there for a long time. There was basically a war fought between the Mormon militia that cropped up in Nauvoo after the church moved there, and the tribes, the Sioux and the Fox Indians. And the same group also would bomb a newspaper office and would be responsible for the Mountain Meadows Massacre upon the church's move to Utah. So what he's talking about within the ex-Danite idea is not an exaggeration. These people were very violent. They were very hardline sectarians within the Mormon Church when they were a part of the church. A lot of them remained in the church and were able to continue doing the same thing. But there were some people who felt spurned and who felt disillusioned over the fact that they had been supported by the leaders of the church all the way up to Joseph Smith, and that the sudden pivot sort of completely disillusioned them with the church as a whole, and so they went out and did their own thing. So it's just a weird element of Mormon and religious history that exists. But it is one of these things that, again, I find so compelling about the history of that church, and that feels just kind of distinctly American to me. So it was interesting to see that crop up in this chapter from Pynchon. The last thing that kind of happens in this chapter is he does indeed, or rather, Sloat does indeed take off after Deuce begins to think that maybe he's sold him out, and so Deuce sort of ends up in a restless state, is I guess the way that I'll put it. And the chapter ends on 272 with a pretty interesting paragraph. Does someone want to read that last paragraph from with to the end of the chapter?
With just the two of them now, Deuce went into a period of no sleep or too little, kept waking up all through the night. Woke once one midnight with no sources of light in the sky, some malodorous evil heap of slag from the processing of moon-chased silver, their night's bed, to see close behind him a luminous face suspended above where her own would have to, for the specter floated high, too high, off the ground, or where the ground was supposed to be. Nor was it exactly her face, either, because it did not reflect light, as from skies or hearthsides, but emitted its own, was marked by that clear sense of a resource being recklessly spent, with nothing gotten back, an expression you'd say of sacrifice. Juice didn't like that, didn't want sacrifices, for they were never in his plans, nor in any cards he knew at play.
So I wanted to ask you guys what your interpretation of this end of the chapter is. Because for me, and this could be a case where this is like a conspiracy corner, this could be a case where I'm just completely wrong. It feels to me as if this is almost a moment in which Deuce is becoming self-aware of what he's done to this woman. And that in seeing this wraith or specter of his wife hanging above the bed, almost as an analog to the actions that he's done in killing Webb and now in sort of engaging in this marriage to Lake, are going to continue to hang above him for what is possibly going to be the rest of a very short life if the Danites catch up with him. And it's that line, particularly of a resource being expended and of sacrifice, that makes me feel like maybe what is being communicated here, what Deuce is coming to an understanding of, is like, this is a woman who only wanted a real relationship with him in a traditional sense. And that the attraction, at least that she held for him, was something that, as we've said a couple times, seemed innocent and seemed, pure of intent, despite all of the other psychoanalysis stuff that you can and should do in considering the relationship. And then in some way, he is confronted with the fact that he has just been using this person up. And that in his interpretation, it is as if he's just using up a resource. That this is a woman who has come to him, that he has exploited and used to the highest degree that he can. And that suddenly he is now understanding that the fact that she has done any of this at all, and the fact that she is even still there next to him, is emblematic of someone sacrificing something. That in his usage of another person, that has, by necessity of the use, required a sacrifice. And that in that he is confronted with his own sort of amorality in dealing with her. That's at least the interpretation I come away with from that paragraph. I was curious how you guys felt about it.
I don't disagree at all with what you've laid out there. I would add, just to complicate it, I think it's also possible to interpret it as like just the beginning of this section of the book. We had the hologram of Jesus essentially being put up in the wake of the flames going throughout New York. And
oh, that's true.
So like this kind of almost feels like in a weird way, kind of like a half dream, him realizing that not only has he, because of who he is, he's not the kind of person who otherwise cares about people, has put her onto a pedestal, and in some sense may be kind of worshiping her self-sacrifice, or be worshiping her as a way to sacrifice himself out of guilt. Like, I think those two kind of things support one another as readings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like y'all's interpretations. I do think that it could be kind of like he's like viewing the death of her innocence.
Yeah,
sure.
Possibly, you could interpret it that way. There's a few different ways you could go with that passage. I do find it interesting that the sentence, nor was it exactly her face either. And it does explain why, and the why does not remind me of Webb at all, really. But that sentence, whenever I first read it, was like, a face that's not exactly her face, but is similar. Earlier in the chapter, it's talked about how you can see Webb's face and Lake's face.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, that just whenever I initially read it or reread it, that's what it made me think of.
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that you're exactly correct in that. Like, a death of innocence is definitely wrapped up in all of that.
And also that idea of like it being Webb's face kind of goes back to the earlier section with no, just last page where Deuce is freaking out about these things, and Kate, you completely legitimately tied that to capitalism. But I think if you're going to take the interpretation of this as web space, that instead of it being necessarily an economic statement, it's more of a general moral statement about what sacrifices do to humans and their relationships.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, and I think too, to complicate matters even further, way back in chapter 3 or whatever, where I had talked about the death of innocence being represented in I don't remember the character's name, but
Dally.
what'd you say?
Dally.
Yeah, with not understanding why the city is closed up, and how you can look at that in terms of the actual historical events that led to the panic and everything, and how that is being portrayed through the death of innocence and relationship. I think Pynchon is reincorporating a similar thing here, but at people of a different age group.
I think that makes sense.
Do we have any other thoughts on this chapter before we move on to the next?
We didn't talk about Willis at all. That's a kind of short, very short part of this chapter. But I did find him interesting, and I do think it's also interesting to think about the fact that Blake had options before marrying Deuce,
Sure.
and I
Yeah.
do think that short section of this chapter is meant, and the guy's a doctor, which at that time would have perhaps been an even bigger deal than it is now. In some ways, in terms of that was probably more uncommon then. I would imagine. She's eligible. You would think that being a doctor's wife, is going to be a little bit more like Maeve is going to be more excited about that. Like her brothers might be more receptive to that than the choice that she eventually makes, which kind of does tie into kind of the death of her innocence, and that the whole sacrifice thing. She does kind of sacrifice her being young and single, and possibly dating people that would be higher in status in society and just kind of more respectable.
Yeah.
Which is maybe an understatement considering the path she goes down.
Yeah, that's true.
No, that's a good catch though. I hadn't thought
It
about
is.
Willis as a symbol for her options at all.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. With the start of this next chapter, we switch perspectives from Lake and Deuce to Reef, and Frank. Sort of once they've buried their father, they're beginning to kind of go their own separate ways, and then soon enough we settle in where we're going to pretty much stay for the rest of this chapter on Frank. And Frank chooses to sort of go back home and try his best to live a normalish life, but he keeps getting harangued by these members of the Vibe Corporation, that whenever he would go in to get a drink somewhere or to get dinner, some sort of random individual would come up to him, and they'd toss him their business cards and give them some sort of offer of employment in one way or another. And after a while, he noticed that this is a pattern. It's always the same company. It's always sort of the same dressed person, but the offers keep sort of escalating, or the titles keep changing. And it's very clear that someone is really trying to get him to come to work. And soon enough, he starts to begin asking about what might have happened to his father, and discovers that there is a link here, that the Vibe Corp is the one who's really responsible for his father's murder. And then we get kind of an interesting view of what these offers look like to people on the outside, that they think, hey, this is actually like a gesture of great charity, that somehow there's something Christian is being done here by old Scarsdale Vibe choosing him to kind of make things up with the son of the man that he more or less either explicitly or otherwise ordered the murder of. And that it just doesn't make sense why Frank won't take him up on these offers. The last line of this paragraph on 274 is great, where it says, "The New York industrialist was rising above these sordid matters of kinship and revenge. Why couldn't Frank? Who could understand ingratitude like that? And what they could not understand, they're not about to hire any source of." So, at a certain point, they just choose to move on and stop trying to get him to come over to their side. And so, this leads Frank to choose to kind of try and go into business for himself. And it says he's soured on silver and gold. Of course, those are big things that are associated with his father. And so he chooses to head on over to Leadville. Now, before we get into Leadville stuff, do we have any thoughts on the way this chapter opens with the offers from the Vibe Corp?
It's pretty sinister. Like, just in the form. Even if you assume that, it's just Frank being paranoid about the intentions here,
Yeah.
because I guess you could read like most of the what is framed as other people's ideas as mostly Frank reading into it. Even if you assume all that, it's still like, what is going on here? Why is this guy? Sure, he is a graduate of the Colorado School of Mines, but like, clearly, like, they are more in need of pure labor than they are in need of people who are like designing the mine shafts and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting kind of what's the word, like a dervish of paranoia and sinister intentions without any real evidence behind it, which is impressive.
Agreed. So there is a line here after it mentions that he's been soured on silver and gold, where it says he'd seen too much misery from the ups and downs of both metals, especially after repeal in 93. The table of elements was full of other possibilities. The weeds of mineralogy, as one of the professors used to say, just sitting there, part of creation, waiting for somebody to figure out how they could be made useful. So that statement, especially after the repeal of 93, gets into some of the stuff that we had talked about just in this last chapter in relation to the panic and everything that led into kind of that evocation of the death of innocence that I had just mentioned not too long ago. But then also that the greater context of the panic of 93. And this particular repeal of 93 refers to the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act that is also previously commented on in the book itself as a contributing factor to that panic of 93, as I had mentioned. Without spending an inordinate amount of time talking about the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and all of the stuff surrounding that economically, the easiest way that I can sum up some of this stuff is that there was a movement called the Free Silver Movement that was going on in the country, where the proponents of that thought that a good way to balance the scales between the richer elements of the United States and the poorer elements of the United States would be to have the currency of the country be bimetallic. So at the time, the currency was gold backed, and it would stay gold backed until we moved off the gold standard as a result of some stuff that Nixon repealed much later on. But because of the difficulty in the average person getting gold certificates, simply because of the higher value and cost of acquiring them, they thought that it would be a good equivalent to have silver certificates as well. And so, in order to kind of support this idea, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act mandated that the government purchase silver at a certain rate in order to continue this process of backing the currency partially with silver. And so the idea from the free silver movement's perspective was, if the government is invested in it, if they're buying silver, and if these silver certificates go up in value that people buy and use as currency from a lower economic threshold, where they begin to match the cost of gold certificates, then you kind of have engineered a way to lift up the impoverished or the lower class people of the United States to a not the same level of wealth as someone from that 1% or top 10%, but you would be able to lift them up to have, at the very least, a closer to adequate purchasing power between these two currencies. Now, really, the sad part about this, and what kind of makes it relevant to the against the day of it all, is that what happened is the government intervention in this and the demand to increase the amount of silver that the government was purchasing led to a big silver boom in Colorado, one of whom the proponents of is mentioned in this chapter that we'll get to. And it led to the over mining of silver. So essentially what happened is, because of the government was mandated to keep buying greater and greater amounts of silver every month, that meant that more of it needed to be mined. And of course, if you're looking at this from a value perspective of metals, the more readily available a metal is, the less value it has. So what started to happen is, as silver was over mined, the actual cost of silver and value of silver crashed, and in relation, the value of gold skyrocketed. And so literally the exact opposite of what the free silver movement wanted happened. And it literally just led to more money in the pockets of the mine owners and of the wealthiest in the country, who could afford to mine silver in the first place. And this is really where a lot of the free silver people started to quibble with this experiment as being a true implementation of their ideals, because they said that by mandating a certain amount of it be purchased and all of that, they actually aren't doing what they had proposed. I think it was probably destined to go this way regardless. I don't know if there's a way that they could have made this work historically. It would have been cool if there was. I wonder what effects that would have had on the country. But it is an interesting aspect to this whole situation, because of the fact that in order to support this movement to lift up impoverished people, it would have required the support and the agreement and cooperation of the richest. The people who were making the money off of shipping the silver, mining the silver, who owned the mines. And of course, there is an additional layer of irony to all of this, in that the need to overmine the silver in order to meet the government's purchasing requirements also meant that there was an oppression of the miners themselves, who needed to work extra to get it out of the ground. So this whole thing was a real cyclical kind of nightmare. And once the run on gold happened and all of the people stopped buying silver certificates, or cashed out the ones that they had for what little gold they could afford, it essentially crashed that currency. And then it also led to a huge market in general. And as we talked about in that Panic of 93 content that I covered in a previous episode, Cody, if you can find that episode, please put it in the description. It was one aspect of multiple things that were happening in history at the time, but it was a big part of it. And so a lot of people's fortunes were ruined. A lot of miners lost their job because now there wasn't a economic interest in continuing to mine silver, at least not at the same time. And towns went bust. As the boom ends, there's a lot of things that go wrong. And so it makes perfect sense for, at this point, the book being in 1903, this is only about a decade ago that this happened, that you would be pretty burned out on the whole bimetallic model and downs of fortunes, as Pynchon puts it. So it makes perfect sense that you'd have Frank looking to do something else. And so that brings him down to Leadville, where there's a sort of the beginnings of a boom on zinc. And this is true to real life. Leadville is an interesting city from a perspective of the kind of history of mining there, because they had rushes on gold, they had rushes on silver, they had rushes on zinc. One of the other metals that's going to be mentioned is molybdenum. They had a rush on that at a certain point. So it is sort of an important city to look at from a perspective of the history of how these different currencies or these different speculative assets kind of rise and fall continuously. We also have a reference in here to Leadville being Haw Tabor's town. I also have some notes on him, but before I move into that, do we have any thoughts on either the silver craft or kind of introduction of this stuff before I continue to talk on historical detail?
I do think it's interesting to view it's interesting that the zinc comes from processing heaps, because a large part of Gravity's Rainbow is about finding like byproducts and like value and new uses for like oil manufacturing, I believe, with like different pigments and stuff. Which is gone into a lot in Gravity's Rainbow, and is kind of in the background for maybe in the background some with like the biography of some of the people that it mentions and some of the corporations that it mentions. But you kind of want to draw a parallel there between the two books because they both kind of explore that concept, at least in glancing ways. I really like that paragraph, though. It is a fun paragraph, and it's really interesting to think about. And what I was just talking about is also kind of there in the talk about the table of elements being full of other possibilities. Is another reference to finding new uses for waste.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a lot of what's going on there. I also think if you want to read into it as like an economic thing, you're seeing like this kind of attempt at sabotaging a less than completely centralized source of wealth being degraded to almost nothing, basically by the power of the people who have the reserve currency. And even that is not sufficient to shut down the kind of the ability for the people on the ground to reformulate sources of profit from their mining. And just to add some notes onto zinc sulfide. So zinc sulfide was used a lot by Nikola Tesla in his experiments with things like X-rays and phosphorescence. And it turns out, actually, and I have no clue what this feels like something that could be like deeply part of Against the Day, but I have no clue how. Zinc sulfide, when submerged in water and exposed to bright light, will catalyze the dissolution of H2O into hydrogen gas and oxygen. No, not sure where that goes, but then just to fill in what zinc is used for, even back then, especially back then, it would have been used for making early batteries and working with electronics because zinc is just so much cheaper than copper, and it's also used to protect metals that are more vulnerable to corrosion through galvanization, and used, this is far from a new use, to take cheap metals like, or not cheap, but low hardness metals like copper, or whatever, and turn them into things like brass and bronze. Zinc also, very common element to add to most forms of steel today. So it's one of those things that is used throughout the entirety of the economy, everything from inside your house. Like if you have a modern American style built house, you have certain like steel rails inside your walls that are conduits. That's the word, conduit for wire and stuff. And that's almost certainly going to be galvanized steel that is then painted. So there's zinc in there. There's probably zinc in your light switches, I believe. There's it's everywhere. It's not. It's kind of the opposite of the noble metals in that way.
Because there's zinc in my body because I took a supplement this morning.
All of us should have zinc in our bones. Yeah, like it's kind of the opposite of those noble metals. That they are valuable because they have no effective use. I mean, these days, silver and gold have industrial purposes, but back then there was effectively none. Back then being 500 years ago. by the 1900s we had uses industrially for them. But anyway, symbolic value versus real value is the simplistic binary there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and two, like to just briefly go back to the mentions of sort of sorting through slag or waste for something else more valuable. I don't remember which of you had said that specific phrase, but it really calls to mind Pynchon's description of this book that like appeared and then disappeared, where he said no reference to present day is intended or should be inferred, in that the book came out in 2006, a couple years before the housing crisis was going to happen, but you could make a very easy parallel between that idea and what a lot of people were doing with high risk mortgages by creating like collateralized debt obligations. They are sorting through all of this sort of waste, fraud, and abuse of signing and selling these mortgages in order to package together another product to sell back to people off of something that was incredibly ubiquitous at the time. I don't know if necessarily that is intended or supposed to be there, but it is certainly something that has continued throughout history in a myriad of different ways.
Yeah. Well, and if we're gonna talk about the whole use of slag, got to bring up what I mentioned a few episodes back. I think I mentioned it, and I think it ended up in the episode. How most of the slag heaps that couldn't be used for this kind of extractive purpose ended up going into concrete, and so all of our major cities are essentially made out of those slag heaps in kind of the same way that they're alluding to with these ancient forms of construction.
As an additional sort of note on the history here, as I mentioned, we do get a reference to Haw Tabor, and Leadville being Haw Tabor's town. This is another case of just like an interesting historical figure that Pynchon doesn't necessarily uncover. He was pretty famous. There's a movie made about his life in the early 1900s as well, but that he's sort of bringing into the fold here. Haw Tabor, or Horace Tabor, as his sort of Christian name is, was known also as the Silver King. So he's a man who initially made his money by taking a payment for supplies in a general store in the form of a stake in a proposed mine operation. So essentially, these guys didn't have the credit to pay for their stuff at a general store, and Haw Tabor took up the purchase for them, and to take payment for himself, he just said, "Yeah, give me a share of the mine you guys are about to crack open." So after this happened, the mine opens and things start getting underway, and he is actually elected as mayor of Leadville, the first ever mayor of Leadville. It turned out that the mine uncovered a load of silver so big it is considered to have single-handedly kicked off the Colorado silver boom, and it made him, in modern dollars, $32 million off of his one share that he had in the mine. He sold his stake in the mine to then buy shares of mines in Cripple Creek, Aspen, the San Juan Mountains, and the Matchless Mine, which is going to be mentioned a little bit later in reference to his widow. But he buys these different shares, and then only a year later, he becomes one of the richest men in Colorado and has a net worth, again expressed in modern day dollars, of over $202 million. He would eventually own 4.6 million acres for grazing in Colorado, 175,000 acres in Texas for copper mining, as well as several interests in South America, and particularly in Honduras, which, if you once again go back to a lot of the stuff that kind of undergirds the Panic of 93, speculative investments in South America were a big part of those different factors that all kind of weaved together. He then rebuilt Leadville and became the lieutenant governor of Colorado. There's an opera house in Leadville that he built that's still there and still in operation that you can go visit. He was then also a senator for 2 months, filling in for someone who had been elected to a higher office in Washington. and he was elected as the president of the Denver Chamber of Commerce in 1891. He would lose everything when the repeal of 93 and the Panic of 93 happened, and he would spend his final years basically penniless, laboring in mines and working as the Denver postmaster for the last year of his life when he died of appendicitis. And this is where we get into eventually the reference to his widow. His dying wish was that his second wife, who was his former mistress, hold on to the matchless mine, and hold she did. She moved into a shack that was formerly a tool shed at the mine and just guarded it, didn't let anyone take it over, didn't let anyone onto the property. And then eventually she died in 1935. So she kept his dying wish alive for a very, very long time, almost 30 years. And at the end of it all, once she had also died, and she died simply because she ran out of firewood one night and was already a bit ill and just succumbed to the elements, essentially. Some people eventually kind of broke into the mine and sorted through what was left of the Tabor kind of fortune, thinking that there had to have been money somewhere. And all they found was a couple of chests that included a set of china, a set of serviceware, a couple of bolts of fine cloth, a tea service specifically, and then some jewelry. And that was it. That was all that was left of somebody who used to be at the pinnacle of success in America at the time. So I think it is also additionally interesting, not just for the stuff that we've already talked about with slag and zinc, but also for Frank to end up in a town that is sort of in and of itself a revenant of an era that has imminently passed. That like Leadville is so, especially at this time, is so uniquely tied up in this one guy who ascended to the heights of capitalism just to be completely thrown down by the same elements of capitalism. That him kind of sorting through what's left of that and trying to build something, I think has some real thematic resonance with the fact that his father was taken out by very similar machinations. It's a different aspect of capitalism that took out his dad, but it is certainly as a result of capitalism as a whole. And so for him to choose to go there, I think is very meaningful to the text overall.
That's a really neat connection. Yeah, I mean, it's way too similar for it to feel a frivolous assertion, because that's how I interface with all of you. Everything you say is frivolous until proven otherwise.
Of course.
That's what I'm here for. Frivolity.
Yeah, frivolity. That's what both of you in particular are frivolous.
I do want to highlight one line.
Yeah.
There lingered some old numinous center of the world willingness to raise species of hell that hadn't been invented yet. I find that line really interesting, and I mean, this book does get into it some with like how raucous and wild a lot of these towns probably were back then.
Yeah.
And the spirit of that does kind of continue in some places. Like Kate just mentioned Cripple Creek, and I think in Cripple Creek they still have casinos. It's there's a few of the mountain towns have casinos and are like destinations for people to drive up there and drink and gamble and stuff, which is interesting that like that's, and it is a thing for especially for young people that are like ski bums. The cliche, especially in Colorado, is that they like to party a lot and stuff, where there that sense of like like partying like the like there's no tomorrow still kind of persists for some people, at least in the mountains of Colorado. I mean, that's true for pretty much anywhere, but it is an interesting subculture still.
Yeah, agreed.
As I am from this sort of stock, I cannot deny.
So as we were talking about, they're trying to reprocess heaps to figure out something else to make money out of. In that section, there is a reference to Molly be damned, as one of the elements that comes out at different temperatures. This is a reference to molybdenum.
So it's
There-
molybdenum.
Oh, okay, thank you. There would eventually be a rush on that material as well. Do you have any thoughts or information on why that has any value? Because I don't.
So molybdenum is a metal that is incredibly valuable in the creation of high-tech metals. I can get real in depth if you want it, but it's not useful. It prevents carbides in steel from forming to larger shards, which means that the overall piece of metal will be stronger and more flexible without deforming. It's also
Okay.
it's part of rosin solder, I believe, and it's like all over pretty much every circuit board that isn't just printed. It's a lot like zinc, except that molybdenum is it's too expensive to be used in literally everything like zinc is. So it is, but it is used in like your cars. The frames have a ton of molybdenum in them compared to historical steel, just for example.
Gotcha. Cool. Do we have any more thoughts on this conversation between Ren and we kind of already referenced it with the idea of these pyramids and the fact that they'll still be there. Someone will stare at them and begin to wonder, as it says, maybe take them for structures of some kind, government buildings, temples, maybe ancient mysteries. Any other thoughts that we had on that? We kind of already made a couple references to this conversation.
I like it. This is not anything about it really. It's just that I think it's really nice to have this this full kind of reconnection of the circle for Webb's interest in alchemy.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, his son is at least engaging in that same kind of thing because he is working on the bleeding edge of chemistry.
Yeah. Well, and especially too having the first line of his romantic interest literally seems a bit like alchemy. I think there's probably something attractive in that to Frank of like, oh, my father was also into that. I wonder what this woman has to say.
It could also be viewed as like a bit of a callback to Gravity's Rainbow and Mason and Dixon, I feel like, as well. That line that it's like alchemy.
Yeah, definitely. I did want to take a minute for Ren Providence's name.
Yeah.
Which I mean, she's from the woods, I guess.
That short conversation they have is really interesting, considering how short it is, and not even all of its dialogue. But it does kind of makes you immediately interested in them. I mean, you're already interested in Frank, but it makes you immediately think that Ren is probably pretty clever and fun to be around, and that maybe this romance is not going to be as frustrating as the romance in the last chapter. That it might be a little bit lighter,
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, there's a real innocence to their interactions with one another. That is kind of only continued to be built when she asks to go to a bordello for strictly what is she, anthropological reasons. And so they do head off to downtown Denver and they go to Market Street specifically, where they visit Jenny Rogers' House of Mirrors. As Luke mentioned in his summary, it's still there. It's not it's obviously not a brothel anymore, but it is. I believe it's a bar that you can go to now. It is an interesting establishment because it was famous at the time for its owners specifically. There was two of them. The original owner was Jenny Rogers. Eventually, it transferred to a second woman named Maddie Silks, and you can read a lot about this person. She had a pretty colorful life for multiple reasons. The most interesting thing that I came across, though, that I think just sort of demands mentioning, is that she is known as being the first woman to engage in a duel with another woman in the state of Colorado. So there was a dispute between Maddie Silks and another woman over Maddie Silks's like longtime partner. And so it led to Maddie Silks demanding satisfaction from this other woman. And so they went out and they actually did have a duel, and Maddie Silks shot the other woman. And this was the first sort of recorded case, or at least notable case. It's possible it happened, in some random area of the state, but the first notable case of duel being fought between two women in the state. So it is certainly a house of some repute, in terms of the not just the ownership, but also just the fact that it was well known. And so the two of them head to this famous brothel, and we get a couple of different interesting sort of moments in this. There's a great line in here where it's introduced that I love, where it says, "Off they went to Market Street and Jenny Rogers' house of mirrors. Wren was immediately surrounded by half a parlor full of girls and gently led upstairs. A little later, he happened to look into a doorway, and there she was, not much on. What there was all black, tightly laced, stockings askew, standing in an open polyhedral of mirrors, examining herself from all the angles available, transformed." I just love the imagery of that writing. And then, of course, they kind of go their separate ways. Frank gets dragged off by a number of the women there, and then Wren is dragged off by at least one woman, but probably multiple, and appears to be transformed by the end of this experience, where she says that she just can't stay away. "Simply ruined me for everyday bourgeois sexuality. Whatever am I to do?" So what do we think about this scene? Other than, Wren coming to the understanding that women belong with women. How do we feel? Because there is something kind of like you had mentioned, Luke, that not just in how this relationship is introduced, that there is something playful and innocent and just kind of fun about all of their interactions. Like this, taken a completely different way and written a completely different way, could be like the horrifying disillusion of like a budding romance, that someone, takes their partner to a brothel, and then this leads to their partner realizing that she's gay, or at the very least is interested in women, or not interested in him, or whatever. But nothing in this, despite the fact that it takes place in a brothel, feels exploitative. None of it feels abusive. And it is in such sharp contrast to the previous chapter, because you would expect that if something is going to feel exploitative, it's probably going to be this kind of setup. It's an interesting sort of trick, I think, that Pynchon is playing here.
There's a lot to love about this scene. There's a lot of really fun details, especially. Jenny Rogers' House of Mirrors is just a great proper noun to include. The line, "All that riding and climbing and outdoor activities, it's a relief to be back in stays again." I forget what stays are, but that line about all that riding and climbing and outdoor activities is very Colorado, even to this day. I do think it's kind of funny, the line. I think it's kind of funny that Wren is so interested in looking at her own reflection, where, it says that she detaches from her self-admiring long enough to turn and seek the girl's eyes with one of those looks of insincere dismay you saw in erotic illustrations from time to time. She's obviously faking dismay and is fine with just looking at herself in a mirror. And then, in the paragraph, when she showed up again, she was in yet another scandalous change of underlinen, holding a bourbon bottle by the neck and puffing on the stub of a Havana. A dressed cavalry helmet with a gold eagle braid and tassels rested at some careless angle among her untended tresses. This is a great paragraph, and this is also kind of, I don't like it. It reminds me of like her putting on a costume that's very erotic, but is reminiscent of like maybe General MacArthur, Ernest Hemingway, somebody like that, where she's obviously kind of parodying military garb and a certain kind of military officer that appears, at least in fiction. of like the overconfident. I guess it just makes me think of MacArthur. I guess in general, I feel like MacArthur was known for smoking cigars, although I could be wrong about that.
No, you're correct. Well, no,
Yeah.
MacArthur was a corncob pipe guy.
Okay. I think you get what I'm talking about. It's just really fun, and I mean, it's really fun to read. It is kind of. I do think that it is possible that Fame and Finesse, already know Frank. They seem very familiar with him from the get go.
Yeah.
So it's possible he's been there before. And it's just I like that we don't get into all the details we got into last chapter, where we're kind of like zone in and out of these scenes. And he kind of takes all of the most interesting parts of probably those scenes and leaves out the more explicit stuff, which is kind of nice. It's a nice break from the last chapter.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it does kind of it's kind of like there's a thing that happens where when people who are generally disenfranchised or treated as lesser than by society are just just have their everyday life taken as like a serious object of inquiry. It tends to be a very fun time for everyone involved. You can see that if you look up any documentaries that are about prostitution. Like usually, the interviews between the documentarians and the prostitutes are very, very lively and fun, even if they're talking about very dark things that have happened. And there's there's this whole kind of beautiful inversion of like what is she going there for, even if you ignore her ostensibly anthropological intentions. She's going there to discover something about herself, and I can't imagine that if you are someone, if I don't know why I'm meandering around it, if you're a sex worker, it's probably probably the most fulfilling part of your job is that aspect of it, if you are not someone who is being ground into dust through hardship. And it's an odd situation because you get the sense that in places like the Old West, so to speak, prostitution was the kind of thing that was a lot more empowered than the stereotypes would have us believe, or even really want to believe, because it's kind of an unpleasant thing to imagine, just because we know what the ultimate exploitation is. But the way it's written in this scene, at the very least, it is as though Fame and Finesse are as exploited as any worker is, which is to say, significantly, but they're not being dehumanized, and that's interesting.
Yeah, agreed.
Especially since, like I said in the last chapter, as unpleasant as it is, the eroticism is effective, whereas in this, there is almost no eroticism. There is self-objectification, and that is implied to be erotic, but it's not written as such, and everything else is left as implication. I don't know what that means, but
yeah, agreed. I mean, I think that it's very obvious that what Pynchon is working with in both chapters is an upending of expectations, and how these sorts of interactions, no matter how they come about, these interactions being like sexual or romantic or otherwise, no matter how they come about or what sort of composition they are, there's a lot of nuance and difference within it. That's like the biggest thing that I think comes up to me in looking at these two scenes, where the sanctity of marriage, so to speak, has an implication that it is going to go one way, and that one way that it is going to go is like just sort of lovely, chaste, healthy interactions. And then you have the opposite of sort of a brothel, in which case a lot of people's singular implication that they think of in those environments is a house of exploitation where all of the women are unhappy. And that is not the way that this particular depiction of one goes in the chapter. But then you have the additional upending of expectations, and that you kind of expect Ren to go one way sexually, so to speak, and that's not the way that she goes. And that has a transformative effect on her understanding of herself. And I think that there is a similar transformative effect on the understanding of Lake towards herself, and also of Deuce towards himself and Lake by the end of the chapter, that comes about as a result of those interactions and as a result of those relationships. That's what kind of immediately comes to my mind in the way that these things are depicted.
I follow your logic quite well.
Sex is just like a big ball of nuance in,
What?
in a number of different ways.
Sex is
Yeah.
complicated?
Yeah, what a revelation. That is not at all what my Christian upbringing told me it was supposed to be.
It's very unidirectional.
After this scene, we get some additional details on Ren, and we learn that Ren has actually come out west as initially part of a sort of expedition to the Mesa Verde sort of relics and the kind of settlements that are out there, the pueblos, I believe is what they are. And what kind of follows from here is a discussion between Frank and Ren about some of the actual aspects of these archaeological sites and of these sort of leftover areas that you can still go and visit. Like, for example, the cave paintings that are brought up here of all manner of stuff, some of which is benign, some of which has monsters in it, and some of which is very sort of frightening to behold, is true. There's a lot of very interesting cave painting and art that is present in these sites. One such source that I went through even says that like there are some depictions of comets, and there are some depictions of what people have assumed to be the Crab Nebula. So there are some questions of like how the people who made them had access to to what those things looked like, or how they knew how to depict them, so to speak, and what they were depicting. There's some reference to cannibalism and fighting that may have taken place in these ruins, and there is some truth in that as well. He is also kind of reflecting the perspective, as I understand it, of archaeologists and researchers of the time, in that they had assumed that these sites were initially representative of the Aztecs, and kind of caught up in this idea of a legendary or historical homeland of the Aztecs. Of course, nowadays, as I understand it, research has progressed to the point where we understand that that is not the case, and that it is the inhabitants of the Taos Pueblos, I think is how it's pronounced. Since you live in the American Southwest, and Luke, you've been all over the American Southwest, I was going to ask if you guys had any more additional context to lend to this conversation, either through exposure to it or study. This is not an area that I am necessarily particularly well versed in. But what I kind of took away from research that I did was that Pynchon is representing a theory that existed about it at the time, and that a lot of the details of it are fairly accurate to how they were actually found, or the state that they were in.
Yeah, you can still go visit some of the cliff dwellings. I know I haven't been to them, but I have family members that have been more than once. It is interesting to view the whole like disappearance of the Native American tribes through the lens of like, I believe that there are other, that happened a few different times with the Mayans, I think at least once, and that happened with other tribes in the in history, where they would just kind of disappear. Their civilization that they had built up would just go away all of a sudden, at least from like the fossil record, the archaeological record. And I don't know, I mean, calling it hallucinatory country and cruel is interesting. I don't know. I mean, Colorado does kind of have especially when you get up in the mountains and especially when you're, in my experiences of driving, when you're in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, things can feel a little desolate. Things can feel like you're kind of on the edge of civilization a bit. Because there won't be anything for miles, no gas stations. You can get pretty rural up in the mountains. And you can kind of get this feeling like you're all on your own sometimes. Maybe that's more of like a driving around in a car thing. But I find her whole backstory thing very interesting. And I mean, Pynchon is the type of author where, like, I know Cormac McCarthy has included, like, did research into medicine of the time that he was depicting stuff. And I think Pynchon is probably the type that did the same type of research where it is interesting that you point out that the theory was current to the time of when this would have happened in history, as opposed to modern views on why these things happened. Yeah, I really like it. I mean, it does just kind of generally imply that the land is somehow cursed, or that there's like an evil inherent to the land that humans can't escape, which I find interesting to think about. And
So yeah, I mean, so I've been to Mesa Verde a couple of times, and I'll say it's a unique part of the world. Maybe like it is a haunting region. It genuinely is. You're so high up. You are like 7,000 feet from sea level, and you have like you drive up this mesa, and then you get to it, and you realize that everything that you call Mesa Verde is really like stuff under this mesa, and you can they're very well documented, these ruins, and so you can find pictures online. And I will tell you, frankly, you're not missing too much because to not see them in person, just because it's the kind of place that is so archaeologically dense that you really shouldn't be spending too much time up close touching things. But it's a fascinating place, and the so I'm gonna get a little bit into kind of the speculative history of Mesa Verde, and it's one of those things where I don't think that I don't get the sense. I don't know. I'm not from a pueblo. I get the sense that people in pueblos might have a little bit more of a contiguous history than has been allowed into the academy, but I do not know. Um, However, what was in public knowledge regarding the inhabitants of Mesa Verde is that essentially it was one of the first places that Native Americans began farming as a main means of survival, and they had found this kind of perfect place where you couldn't see it from a long distance away, and it took a lot of effort to get to, and so they felt safe to build these palatial type apartments, essentially, is what you could call them. And they uh, there are a lot of other pueblo ruins throughout the Southwest that are uh, it, and it's interesting. You do see the development of the architectural techniques, and you do see it as compared to Mesa Verde. You see things become more comfortable and more not I wouldn't call it modern, but more determined than they are in Mesa Verde, where it feels like, to some extent, at least with a couple of the sites, people were just kind of putting up walls where they had put a campfire, and it just kind of naturally grew out of that. But it seems like the inhabitants of Mesa Verde essentially experienced a long period of drought leading up to, and a shock of colder weather around the time of its desertion. And at the same time, down in New Mexico, I mean, I'm not sure how far south, probably about 100 miles. I'd have to check. there's another ruin called Chaco Canyon that dates just a little bit more recently, and by just a little bit I mean significantly more recently. But they were inhabited at the same time. Their inhabitants overlap significantly. Is what I'm trying to say. And what seems likely is that right around that same time that the climate had shifted and Mesa Verde, simply due to its altitude, was having a harder time growing crops. I want to say that's the same time that a lot of the Anasazi descended tribes began to make their way into the Southwest. And today we know them as Navajo, Apache, Comanche, and a few others. The Anasazi tribes were these tribes of people that around the time of the setting of this conversation in Against the Day was just so barely understood that people couldn't figure out, were these the original peoples who then just all of Native American people are descended from? Are these people who invaded and did this or that? And what's kind of being talked about there is the idea that the Anasazi had become a dominant hunter-gatherer and raiding/trading society or collection of societies throughout what in Europe was like late medieval period. And between the power struggle between the power struggle of Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon of the Pueblo culture, which probably just due to like geographical happenstance, Chaco Canyon ended up much wealthier because it's just easier to get there and do trading and stuff in its vicinity. It does seem like the Chaco Canyon people ended up waging a lot of war against the Mesa Verde peoples. And because of the particular way that the people in Mesa Verde had used middens, trash heaps, what we now call landfills and dumps, same difference, just we put plastic on it now. They would, it seems like they would place their deceased in with the middens, and so the trash of the society was viewed as valuable as the trash of the body, and vice versa. And as such, what might have been cannibalism, and I think there's a little bit harder evidence for cannibalism today than there would have been that was at least clear back in the early 1900s. It might well have started as starvation due to like a siege. It might well have started due to starvation from famine. It might well have not been cannibalism. It may have just been like grave desecration, essentially, because they had this implied reverence for the discarded, that to desecrate the discarded remains within the greater discard would be an even greater insult to these people who were in this economic war and or political war.
It is an incredibly fascinating history. And even as you mentioned, like not having been there, but having seen the photos of it, it still radiates with like ingenuity and interest of that civilization, basically, like you mentioned, building apartments at that time in sort of the development of human society. It's something where I've seen the photos like at various moments in my life, but every time I've gone back and looked at them, it remains impressive and just quite a feat of humanity, I think. And there are things you can look at sometimes where even if you don't see the history, or if you don't know the history, or like don't necessarily know the people group that come from there's like, I'm trying to think of any word other than majesty to it that just, I don't know. There is an attraction within that site, I think. And I think that some of that is what Pynchon is kind of striking at in this excerpt.
Yeah, and just not necessarily related to Mesa Verde in particular, but throughout Pueblo cultural, throughout regions that have historically sustained Pueblo cultures, those kind of petroglyphs with what's described as human-looking bodies with snake and lizard heads. That is a thing all throughout the Southwest, and they are really the only not purely racist origins behind the whole ancient aliens kind of line of thinking. Because it's weird. It's probably because they were depicting gods or mindsets.
Yeah.
But no, you look at places like Mesa Verde or Chaco Canyon or what's it called in southern Arizona? There's a similar ruin. Aztec Palace, I think, was the old school name that isn't Aztec. Like if you really take the time and you really pour over photos, or if you spend time in those regions, the whole idea that like racists will harp on about like, oh well, how come no continent other than Europe or Eurasia has ever developed great society? When you look at places like Mesa Verde, this was a great society. This was like smaller scale, but like a London. It was
Yeah.
It's
The buildings. It's not as cramped as you might assume. Like the buildings are larger than than you would assume. I think. But the whole thing is a lot more impressive than I think people give it credit for.
Yeah. Like there are those old ruins that like I described as being like, oh, they had a campfire and they put a wall up. There are those, but they're just buildings. They're just built entire massive masonry megastructures that sustained an entire society.
And so kind of moving from the literal what's on the page to the thematic what's on the page here, I wanted to also ask you guys what Pynchon is maybe doing or analyzing with this section. And if the answer to this question is just it shows up later in the book and we'll get to it, then that's fine. But to me, like it really comes down to, in my perspective, the last line, that if they were the same ones who made the exodus sort of southward from Aztlan and became the Aztecs, they might have something to do with those human sacrifices the Aztecs became famous for. My scan of this section is like, yes, Ren represent someone who is engaging in anthropological research and is evoking opinions and thoughts of the time. But to me, I think that maybe there is an argument that is being made, or a thematic gesture being made, about the idea that when you start building up civilizations or societies that are becoming modern, that even if it was 300, 3,000, 3 million, whatever years ago from where you're at, there are still these kind of strains of evil that can come out of that, and that one kind of has to keep in check in sort of going about and making the world, and that in a sort of evident culture that, like you had mentioned, is sort of a London but smaller, this still led to destruction and death and chaos, and there seems to be some like weird religious or potentially godlike imagery or outer space imagery associated with it. And a lot of this stuff, like if you just kind of try and play a movie in your head of what this would look like to watch from a standpoint of the chaos and the kind of frenzied painting and cannibalism, it is not necessarily unlike the New York section from earlier in the book, where like the specter of modernity or capitalism arrives, and then suddenly the city goes into chaos and the power goes out and people start going mad, and that what is being experienced at this point in sort of the turning of history isn't necessarily new, but it is maybe served up differently, is maybe what I think Pynchon might be getting to at a thematic perspective. I may be crazy. He may be doing something else completely different. But I wanted to ask you guys your interpretation on it.
I do think that there's an element of loss of innocence as well. I mean, she's a year out of college. She spent that year, um, up in the mountains, really seeming to have uncovered evidence of like you were saying, like real evil. And in school, she was like, that kind of brings me back to like the map and the territory thing. Where in school, she's probably taught the map, but when she's out in the territory, the reality of what she's having to do and the reality of what she's uncovering seem to have traumatized her pretty deeply, I would say. Where it's not like, sometimes these kind of stories can be told in like a deliberately um manufactured way where you're just trying to scare someone. That's not really what she's doing. She seems to be really sharing with Frank, what's been plaguing her, what's been on her mind a lot. Where she's kind of unloading on him, I guess.
Yeah, I think both of y'all are right. I mean, I when I read that last paragraph, I can't help but think of the conversation in the Explorers Club about what's his name? Bird? No, not Bird. One of them trying to get their dogs to eat each other so that they wouldn't have to bring as much food on the trip to the North or South Pole. And it feels like this section is kind of getting at that whole layer of where there are people and where there is resource deficit, there is evil, as well as like the way that she is an anthropologist. And I don't even necessarily read it as like a loss of innocence per se, but more of like a genuine trauma of like, which, of course, loss of innocence is supposed to be a genuine trauma, but one that happens when you're 10 or something. But she's out there and she's digging through all that remains of thousands of people's deaths, and like she is inhabiting it. She probably camped out in Mesa Verde. She probably didn't leave it for months and months. She probably spent all day, every day, looking at bone fragments and seeing how people cracked them and tore the marrow out. And like that is evil. That if there is physical embodiment of evil, it is the broken shards of human remains.
Mm-hmm.
And so she is just someone who has done this hard work of researching all of this in person and pieced bones together probably to figure out which went with which. And as it said, hard professors modalities are, and then somebody else now is writing up the report. Career expectations will be a factor. I'm just one of the hired hands that dug in the dirt. And so she is the scientific version of, is it Stanley Kotex in Lot 49 who is the disgruntled engineer? Yeah.
Mm.
She's the science side of that. And she is saying, look, history is going to be written that doesn't capture the horror that happened there. They're going to write some simple thing that talks about evidence of cannibalism. They're going to say, well, this bone shard implies this thing, but they didn't have to live it. And in some sense, that is both unfair to the history of the land, but it's also unfair to Ren, who is somebody who took on a burden for this research.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can also, I think the Kotex comparison is apt, but I think you can also take that same comparison to just mining in general in this book, in that you have either Webb or any of these people who spend their lives working at some points, depending on when in the labor struggle it is, 13 hours a day, digging in the dirt at first, by hand with tools, and then eventually with dynamite, destroying their bodies from a standpoint of its health and physicality. In some cases, just dying due to cave-ins or misapplication of dynamite or what have you. And it's all for, as we talked about back in the WFM episode where I covered that whole history. It's all for like $3 a day, or like or even less in some cases. And meanwhile, you have these plutocrats and vibes and all of those people that own these mines making thousands and thousands and millions of dollars off of that and sharing such a small quantity of profit. They're the people you know about, right? Like we talk about people like the Silver King, or we talk about who he's mentioned on the next page, like Bulkley Wells, or we talk about the robber barons, right? But we have no clue who the names are of the people that created that net worth, or who expanded the West, or who started the zinc rush, or any of these things. I think that there's a very good comparison between what she's doing and the trauma that may not be physical, but is instead mental and emotional, and the publishing of this great history and this great excavation and these findings.
Indubitably.
So from there, we kind of move into the last section of this chapter, where they end out on 17th Street. They're kind of going from joint to joint, and eventually they end up at a place called the Albany, with a quote legendary bar mirror. It's 110 feet long, an animated mural of Denver's nighttime history. Like reading the paper, said Booth Verbling, a crime reporter of Frank's acquaintance. And from here we learn that there is a sort of undercurrent of violence coming about in Telluride around Reef. And Frank doesn't exactly know what it is, but there are some people that represent Bulkley Wells who are kind of creeping about. And again, if you go back to that WFM episode where I talked extensively about the history, he's a real guy. He's a real piece of shit. He was the guy that I mentioned who had like a philosophical belief that working class people were beneath him, that he would try to articulate. He was incredibly anti-union. He agitated for direct violence against members of the WFM. He was a sheriff's deputy at one point that he used to influence sort of strike breaking. And eventually he became captain of Troop A of the Colorado National Guard. So again, if we're going back to the previous chapter and some of the stuff that I talked about as far as how the National Guard was kind of really wrapped up with the mine owners and all this stuff, he is a great example of that. He crosses over into both worlds as far as what he is responsible for. And so at this point, Frank kind of realizes that the trouble of everything is not over, and that he's going to have to head out to Telluride and try and get in contact with his brother Reef and figure out sort of what's going on, and to kind of continue to chase down his father's killer, or at the very least stay in contact with this world that he has only had a brief reprieve from, which is really what this relationship with Ren kind of comes to represent in this chapter, at least. The fact that the chapter starts with him being chased about by members of the Vibe Corporation trying to hand him a job, to he has this brief kind of beautiful but fleeting, not quite romance, but almost romance, that really is a moment of peace in these past couple chapters, only for the truth of his situation to come rearing its ugly head again. And I think, as he asks Ren to come with him, as this chapter closes out, and she isn't going to, I think that kind of represents that, like, if he's going to go view, or rather, if he's going to go meet up with his brother and view all that's going on and be involved, that he kind of can't take that piece with him. That it's something that needs to stay behind, because it's not gonna be able to thrive. It's not gonna be able to exist if he goes back to Telluride. But there's something deep inside of him that knows that he has to. Any thoughts on this sort of last scene in the chapter and what's going to be coming next?
Do you really like the paragraph on 279 where Frank is reminiscing about trying to outrun, or maybe not trying to outrun, but getting stuck in a big storm that he sees coming. There's the metaphor there doesn't maybe need to be explicated on too much, but it's a beautifully written passage. I do like the reference to South Pacific Islands. Go specialize in cannibals, huh? I've been to Papua New Guinea. I believe that that area is called the South Pacific Islands, and it's a really interesting area in a lot of ways. There've been parts of this chapter that have kind of reminded me of R.A. Lafferty, who's an author that I've recently been getting into. But he served time, or he didn't serve time. He was in the military and was stationed in the South Pacific and around Papua New Guinea during World War II, I believe. So I just wanted to point that out. I do think that Pynchon is read more what is at least classified by most as genre fiction than people give him credit for.
Totally.
I honestly I don't blame Ren for not going with Frank, and I don't think the reader is supposed to.
No, yeah, absolutely.
That almost certainly would have been one of her last decisions, if I was to guess.
Just it's not a huge thing, but I do just like when Pynchon kind of jumps back to his old ways and does a chapter kind of inside out like this one is.
Mm-hmm.
Or you do get a little bit of direct linear chronology, but then you just spend the middle half of the chapter at the end of everything, I guess, because it gives you some nice dramatic irony with that specializing cannibals line that Luke mentioned. But no, I don't make too much of it, except as an excuse for Frank to deliver some exposition, because he's not the kind of guy who's going to have brooding thoughts that are going to appear in the narrative, and he's not the kind of guy who's going to just dump it all on somebody, but he will explain this insane epic story of his family to a random anthropologist. Frank's not a dumbass, and he's not a simple man. He's just a frank one.
I see what you've done there.
All my work.
So, any funny parts between these two chapters that we didn't talk about? There's not too many of them, I think, but the one that does come to mind during that last sort of scene at the Albany is when the guy who comes in sort of not a rank suddenly gets distracted because he sees someone who he knows from the ice saw murder case, which is not a real thing near as I can tell. I'm sure someone was killed with an ice saw at some point in the Old West, but is just a thing that Pynchon writes in there that just kind of made me stop dead in my tracks and go, wait, what? Like, it confused me for a second. I had to reread the passage because it just comes out of nowhere. And then I finally realized that he's going to go talk to someone who was roped up in whatever that was. But beyond that, I can't think of really any other funny moments in these chapters that we didn't talk about.
I can't find the passage right now, but I do think that Pynchon calls Deuce abbreviated as in he's short, which is pretty funny. That's about the only one that we didn't cover out of all of it.
Aside from those, all I have to mention is the number of sincere jokes from the characters of Deuce and Sloat, who are making jokes that are objectionable, are both objectionable and objectively well structured jokes, even if they're not original, and just how much they are not funny to read because of how effectively characterized they have been as monsters.
That's a fair point. Yeah. And what do you guys think is the most Pynchon part of these chapters?
I'm gonna go with the line, "She moved, spooned in his embrace, feeling no need to turn to exchange a look, communicating by way of her unexpectedly articulate ass." Just doesn't feel like something anyone else would come up with.
That's unexpectedly articulate in describing his ass is pretty Pynchonian specifically.
Mine is probably just we don't get that many details, but all this stuff about reprocessing waste, which I've already been over. I maybe talk about Gravity's Rainbow too much on this podcast, but I do like that it's a theme that Pynchon continually revisits. just because it just interests me. Like, for whatever reason, I think it's just maybe a human urge to think it's funny, or maybe not funny, but fun and cool that you can find like all this desirable stuff off of what was once viewed as trash or waste or a burden.
Or my pinch on part of the chapter, I think, is probably the way that he describes those slag heaps, just like his actual way of taking them and turning them into something like mythic, I guess the best way that I can think of to put it. Like, I would agree with you, Luke, that like a lot of the stuff that he's doing in that regard feels very distinctly him. That like this is not just sort of the cast-offs of war that these represent, and the illusion of them being two pyramids and kind of representative of a civilization, especially how that is then reincorporated 2 pages later with all the talk of Mesa Verde. Stands out to me as being a particularly Pinchonian thing. So what about quotes? Anyone got a quote directly off the top that they want to share?
I can go. On page 266, it's during the wedding. The officiating presence, a Swede migrated west from the Dakota country, wore gray robes heavy with dust, face indistinct as if shadowed beneath a hood, not so much reciting the well-known words as singing them. In a harmonic minor drone, this congenial soundbox smoothed into dark psalm. The bride wore a simple dress of pale blue albatross cloth, fine as a nun's veil. Sloat was best man. At the big moment, he dropped the ring, had to go on his knees in the dim light to look for where it might have rolled. "Well, how you doing down there?" Deuce called out after a while. "Better not get too close," Sloat muttered. And it's, first of all, just some really ingenious description going on there.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it's just a nice... No, there's no also. I don't know why I said that, sorry. That's all. It's nice.
It is nice. I agree. It's a moment of real innocence from two stone cold killers. Mine comes from 274 in referencing the Vibe Corporation constantly reaching out to Frank. He was no detective and had not spent much time investigating, but from keeping his ears open up and down the street, he could not escape a suggestion that Vibe Corp, who had spirited away his kid brother Kit, was also behind Webb Travers's murder. This complicated for him any question of a serious future as a mine engineer, at least in the U.S. Maybe he'd have to think about going abroad. Every hiring office Frank walked into this side of the Rockies had heard of him, knew of Scarsdale Vibe's ample-spirited offers, and wondered why Frank wasn't at least a Vibe regional executive by now. How was Frank supposed to explain? The man might have had my father wiped away, carelessly as a wet ring on a bar top, and I am reluctant to accept his charity? Of course, they thought they knew the whole story already, and were stunned at the Christian daring of Scarsdale's gesture to Frank. Seeing that custom and usage in the mountains at this time would have been to see him dry gulched as swiftly as possible, just in case of anarchism in the blood or something like that. The New York industrialist was rising above the sordid matters of kinship and revenge. Why couldn't Frank? Who could understand ingratitude like that? And what they could not understand, they were not about to hire any source of. I like that one for a number of reasons. One, the specific line of this man might have had my father wiped away carelessly as a wet ring on a bar top is just a great, I love that line. And then, it's another case of several moments in these 2 chapters where just Pynchon kind of delivers like a gut punch to you over the state of this family and the different members of the family, between Maeva needing to sort of get out of town and like completely leave all that behind, to Lake realizing that she's going to lose her husband, and every thought that she has about what this marriage could have been is sort of dissolving, to now this Frank caught in the center of it, having this company chase him around, and also having to think about all of the other things that this company has already done. And he doesn't, of course, as far as I am aware, know about Lake and Deuce at this point, but even just the the understanding of the death of his father and the fact that Kit is kind of caught up in their clutches, that must feel so hopeless. And back then, being in Colorado and Kit on the East Coast, you're so far apart from one another that the chances that he's going to be able to, get his brother out of the thrall of the company, or that something is going to change or get better, probably feels really distant. And yet at the same time, it is right in front of him because he can't get away from these company executives. And yeah, it was a really evocative piece of writing, and just another one of those cases where Pynchon is really mining the tragedy of the situation, so to speak, and all of the different layers inherent to it. I thought it was just brilliant.
That quote comes from 279. I may not read the whole paragraph, but I'll read at least the beginning and the middle. Long habits of holding back information, especially from young women one was currently sparking, usually kicked in about this point. Once out in the proper noun that I don't want to pronounce, plateau, Frank, riding back from Gunnison or someplace, spotted a single storm cloud, dark and compact, miles away, and knew despite the prevailing sunlight and immensity of sky that no matter how he changed his direction now, he was going to cross paths with that cloud. And sure enough, less than an hour later, it all grew dark as midnight, and there he was getting soaked and frozen and being momentarily deafened by lightning bolts that hit blasting all around, leaning along his horse's neck to reassure him that everything was just peachy. Though being a range horse, the critter had seen far worse and was presently trying to reassure Frank. Then it goes on to kind of abstractly describe Ren in an interesting way. Even the beginning of that paragraph is kind of funny with the long habits of holding back information around women. This is when he would just shut up or change the subject usually, because he senses that what comes next is negative. Everyone pretty much has experienced seeing a storm on the horizon and knowing it was going to hit them. I mean, that would obviously be a much bigger deal back in the day whenever you just had a horse to get you somewhere, or even not even a horse. You were just walking around in the mountains and that would happen. The storms can kind of come up really quickly in the mountains and in the like foothills and the areas like right up against the mountains. Storms can happen really quickly. And then there's just the obvious metaphor that with this news that Frank has gotten, he has to kind of revisit old traumas and get back into kind of the shit of it. You could definitely draw a line between this paragraph and the whole Lake being child of the storm thing, where Lake has created, we didn't really get into too much of the fact that Juice and Sloat are looking for Frank or want to talk to him. But that also would not be, hearing that your father's killers want to talk to you is not going to be a positive. To where there is a lot of foreshadowing to this that I honestly kind of forget how it goes. Whenever he returns to the mountains, or even if it's even kind of given much page time. I remember some parts deeper into the novel related to this storyline, but not just kind of what happens immediately next. And it's a beautifully written paragraph as well.
I almost picked that one.
It's a great one. All I can say as far as foreshadowing or anything like that, I just hope that Deuce and Sloat die very violent, protracted deaths. I was speaking to my fiance about this after I had finished these 2 chapters, where I was just like, ordinarily, Pynchon villains are pretty reprehensible people, but there is something about them that is like interesting or compelling. I think of Windust in particular, which is the example she brought up too, because I don't know how much I've talked to her about Bleeding Edge, but it's a fair amount. And it just feels like these 2 in particular are just so irredeemable and so beyond the pale that, like, yes, there is some stuff within the dynamic that we've talked about over, the past 4 hours of this episode that is intriguing, but I hate them I do, especially from like a very deep portion of my soul.
I agree.
I'm rooting for him, young lovers, not gonna stand in that way.
If only they could realize that what they really love is each other.
Exactly.
That does bring us to the end of our discussion on these two chapters of Against the Day. In our next episode, we're going to be discussing 24 and 25.
The final lines of our next section, if you don't have the standard Penguin edition, in which it will end on page 317, the final line that you are going to be looking for is, "But he knew that feeling, and he guessed it would pass."
And as always, you can get a hold of us through a number of different ways. And in fact, we did get a nice reincorporated message on our Instagram. Luke, did you want to read the message that we got today?
Yeah, so it's from let me look. Paulo Ferreira, I believe. The message reads, "Hey guys, I just wanted to let you know that I just finished listening to the Vineland episode you recorded almost 2 years ago where you answered my question that he'd asked on here. I gotta tell you, really strange feeling when I realized you were essentially talking to me, haha. Very glad you keep going. I will be finishing the Vineland series in the recent OBAA episode, and will keep listening to you every time I'm reading a Pynchon novel. Best wishes to you all. Hope everyone is doing well, and if you record anything in response to this message, I will get back to you in another 2 years or so. Haha." Yeah, honestly, I probably should have messaged you back whenever we answered your question on air and told I should have messaged this person back. But it is kind of funny that they sent that message and got the information they needed, even if it was 2 years later. I believe the initial question was about a podcast that I think Kate had mentioned or something like that. Let me look. Yeah, it was a podcast. It was a podcast with a British professor who had read it, I think, Crying About 49 multiple times or something.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
The backlisted episode. Another way that you guys can get in touch with us is through email. We do have some emails from our listeners. This first one comes from Dan, who emailed us saying, "Thank you for yet another engaging episode. And while I thought you three held things up well, I look forward to Kate's return." Well, I hope that I did not disappoint you, Dan. Um, I discovered your podcast when embarking on my third reading of Against the Day, this time primarily as an audiobook read by the incomparable Dick Hill, who is not so much a depth as a breadth to the narrative, with perfect inflections and voices, letting me pick up subtleties on every page that I missed the first two times around. Strong recommend for everyone and anyone who is revisiting the book. I have one comment from the last episode, and then a more general one about my personal theory about what's going on. You all discussed the battle around the Campanile in terms of naval warfare, which makes perfect sense given TRP's background. But what it made me think of initially is video games, like Asteroids or Space Invaders. I thought to myself, damned if he didn't come up with this elaborate passage while playing something on his couch for hours. And if you reread the battle scene, you can spot some other imagery that makes it appear this is all playing out on a two-dimensional pixelated screen. Perhaps only allegorically, but still. Even the Campanile's collapse is described as how it would collapse in an old video game. My other thought is just my back of the envelope theory about what's going on in this book that I hadn't heard you all mention yet. If you haven't already, you need to get your hands on a piece of Iceland spar. Buy one online, go to a rock museum, perhaps Google Iceland spar near me. You can also check out the type on the cover of the original hardcover edition where you can see its effect. You all have repeatedly mentioned that there appear to be multiple dimensions in play here. I'd like to suggest that there are exactly two of them, and that is one of the novel's major premises. If some incalculable substance could split space and time in the same manner that Iceland spar splits light, it would create twin and parallel universes, between which some characters can apparently, though with some difficulty, traverse. See what I did there? Yes, I did. The twin parallel dimension theory explains why Lou is unclear about his past and his later deliverance to NNN. It explains the sounds Madame Eskimov heard during the seance. It could be what's behind the chums' multiple existential crises and their dual existence. It explains Miles' visions, including and especially the one in the last chapter. It would certainly explain the Vormance expedition, making it an actual event in one of the twin parallel dimensions. Perhaps the Vormance expedition happened in one world's timeline, and 9/11 happened a century later in another, as some kind of historical dimensional echo. As I said, this is just my working back of the envelope theory, and I encourage you to poke any holes in it that you may spot, but it seems to make a lot of things fall into place for me. Thank you for all for doing what you do. Having you as companions for my latest reading of Against the Day has improved my life considerably. Keep up the great work. Yours in bilocation, Dan. P.S. Some of my favorite moments have been when you all give some pinch on wiki posts the rhetorical thrashings they deserve. More, please. Dan, thank you for the email. I hope that my return to the show was worth the wait for the episode that I had missed. I don't know how long ago it was that I had mentioned this, but I had said something to the effect of that I had like a big conspiracy corner that I wasn't ready to fully talk about yet. And it is more or less what you have described as your back of the envelope theory. This idea that there are two sort of parallel universes in which these events are happening, or that things are crossing back and forth between. And the examples you gave about like Bass Knight's background and how he kind of dies and jumps between one to the other through the explosion and all of that. I think it totally explains a lot of that. I totally grok what you're talking about, and was sort of waiting to more fully explore that idea once I had a better way of kind of writing my thoughts out on paper, or at least rhetorically. I actually, and funny enough, I actually did purchase a piece of Iceland Spar. It sits on my bookshelf now in front of the Pinch-On section of books that I own. It's a pretty cool mineral just to kind of like play with. So yeah, you and I are totally on the same page there. And there's a lot of weird stuff in the Pinch-On wiki for this book. I don't know why. The other Pinch-On wikis that I have utilized as we've recorded this show and looked at as a basis of research seem pretty uniform. Like the one for Bleeding Edge especially is really solid. There's something weird about the Against the Day one where there's arguing going on in it, or like the Pinch-On wiki for this section of chapters, there's some where a guy is just repeating like what's on the page, or just posting question marks to references, or just including things that are completely unnecessary to the purpose of a wiki. It's very odd. But yeah, thank you for your email, and thank you so much for the nice comments that you shared about having us along for the journey. And yeah, keep listening and write in again if you have any more thoughts or theories. We love hearing from you guys.
I did really like all this stuff about video games.
Yeah,
Very, very plausible.
Mhm.
Pinch-On seems like the type to play arcade games and stuff like that. I did want to point out that that would kind of jive with the whole
Tetris
chums,
thing.
like one of the yeah, it would jive with the Tetris thing, definitely. But also with the with like the way that whenever you really play a video game a lot, you can kind of start predicting what the computer is going to do, because the chums like see a few minutes or a few seconds in advance, like supposedly is a small detail of that section, to where you can kind of, once you get like the feel of a level or something, you see it in speedrunners, people who do like video
Mhm.
games, very very like go through older video games very very quickly. Yeah, I just really like that section of the email too.
And then we did get another email. Luke, did you want to read that one out?
Yeah, this one is from Max Spatz. Hi there. In the last episode, you struggled to make heads or tail of the tarot reading. I came to the conclusion that Pynchon has no emphasis on the esoteric meaning of the cards. He's all about the iconography and an elaborate visual pun. The winged lion is the symbol of Mark the Evangelist, also known as San Marco. San Marco is the patron saint of the city of Venice. There is a legend that says that Mark encountered an angel at the lagoon, where later Venice would be founded. The angel looked like a winged lion, told him Pax T I don't know how to pronounce Latin. Pax Tibi Mars Evangelista Meus, I think maybe. I don't know. That is why Mark is often portrayed as a winged lion with a book showing the Pax Tibi saying. So the winged lion can mean two or three things: San Marco, or the city of Venice, or an angel. It is stated that Miles entered this vision of San Marco as the angel winged lion. Chick's regard to the Carpaccio painting is misleading because the painting doesn't portray this legendary encounter. That is why Miles corrects him immediately. Miles says that the message he gave to the San Marco was unimportant. He thinks the vision was a message for the chums, not Mark. The Campanile di San Marco is dedicated to Mark the Evangelist. There are two campaniles. The first one got destroyed in 1902 and the one that was rebuilt in 1912. The real historic reason for the collapse is that the tower got struck several times by lightning and didn't get repaired. In the tarot reading for Chick, the tower lands 3 times on the pyramid top. The other major arcanas that get drawn are Temperance and Strength. Renata states that the lower cards influence the upper cards. In the Rider Waite deck, the tower card shows a tower that got hit by lightning. Strength shows a woman embracing a lion. The Temperance arcana shows an angelic figure standing with one foot in a lake pouring water from one cup to another. In my reading, the chums are some kind of angelic being. They started out as humans, but as Randolph warns Chick in the first chapter, there is some greater truth to be learned when he will become a real member. They are associated with the sky and they see the earth dwellers as different from themselves. The way they get their instructions can only be described as divine intervention. They work in mysterious ways and their leader is invisible. And as they begin to realize, it might as well be true that all aeronauts have the same leadership. As Miles states in the beginning of the chapter, the Italian numbers are just like the American. The organization of the chums has counterparts all over the world. Sorry, they keep on. This person, there's a typos in the email where they call the chums the chumps. It just keeps making me want to laugh that he's calling them chumps. Anyway, I expect them to be as angelic as the chums. So are the Russian aeronauts. It is Chick who greets Darby with Peaks TV. That suggests to me that he somewhat assumes his role as an angel. So what should we make of all of that? First, it is stated in the text that the tower card most likely represents a real tower. Renata suggests it might as well be the Campanile. However, the cards have a clue. If you remove the woman from both the Temperance and the Strength card and combine those images, you get a winged lion. I think the reference to the Carpaccio painting is only there to strengthen this association, since the lion in that painting is standing the same way in water and on land as the angel on the Temperance card. One reason I think the iconography is supposed to be taken literally is because in the tarot reading, the ends due for Lou, it is heavily implied that Webb's final pose matches the hangman's one. So this could mean that this is not any old tower. This is the Tower of the Winged Lion, the Campanile di San Marco. Since the tower card gets drawn several times, there are several lightning strikes. So this references the past of the tower. As you already state, the book is all about how past and future are connected in tangled ways. But wait, there's more. As I wrote above, the winged lion also represents an angel. This suggests that the angels, meaning the crews of the Inconvenience and the Bolsheva Igra, take part in the destruction of the tower. I don't know why the tower gets drawn 3 times. It would be an easier case if it was 2 times, since the tower got rebuilt in the future. But that would lose some of the past erosion, present destruction, future rebuilding metaphor. However, this is an elaborate construction, so I'm willing to gloss over it. What I made of it is that with the destruction of the tower, some part of the magical old world dies, and it happens out of carelessness. This edges on the First World War. I wonder if any of the ships would have claimed to hit the Campanile that could have triggered the war early, and that is why comparisons to 9/11 suggest themselves. I must say, I do love when Pynchon flexes in this multi-layered way. Hope you all have a great week. I'm looking forward to the next episode. It is one of the most heart-wrenching chapters in the book to me. Peaks, TB, Mapers, Max. I really appreciate this email. It provides a lot of context and stuff that we just didn't mention or go over. or were unaware of. I didn't mean to make fun of you for the chumps thing. It just makes me laugh. Yeah, this is a really interesting email. I don't know. This person obviously knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, at least, and gets into some really interesting stuff. That I mean that section of the chapter from our last episode about Against the Day is very dense and hard to parse. So a lot of this really helps, I think.
Yeah, that leads us to YouTube comments. One we got from Ryan Ayler 6470. Great stuff. Thanks for putting this together. And of course, you're welcome. Our payment, as always, is due in either money or praise, and either will suffice. So thank you very much. We also got a comment from Radman1136 that reads, "Sorry, but I can't not. I seem to recall more than one of you, for some reason, proclaiming that Pynchon was done, would not publish again. Full stop. Made it sound like arriving at 88 was tantamount to dead. And if that's how you felt, then I'm sorry for that implication. However, I would encourage you to look at an actuarial table and recognize that we cannot divine the future. However, thank you for your feedback regardless."
If there were betting odds on this kind of
Yeah.
stuff, I feel like the betting odds would have been that Pynchon was done.
With the way that online gambling is going, I can only imagine that is a bet you could make at this point.
Mhm.
Yeah, Kalshi should sponsor us.
Oh man. So yeah, as you can see, there are multiple ways to get in touch with us, and we appreciate it whenever our listeners do. Those ways specifically that you can get in touch with us are, of course, on Instagram. We are there at Mapping the Zone Podcast. We are on Twitter at PinchonPod. We are on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone. You can email us at pinchonpod@gmail.com. Or no, that's not our email. It's mappingthezonepodcast@gmail.com. And we are on YouTube for any comments you may have related to specific episodes at Mapping the Zone. And we do, if you happen to like this show enough to purchase a mug or a t-shirt or a tote bag or a sweatshirt or any number of other mass-produced items of clothing, you can do so. We have a spread shop up at Mapping the Zone over there. And if you also happen to like this show enough to pay $1 for it, we would love it if you donated that $1 to us. We are available for any donations on Ko-Fi at Mapping the Zone. Big thank yous to all of our donors for sending through money that has been used to upgrade recording equipment, replace recording equipment in one case where it was stolen, pay for our hosting fees yearly, pay for tickets to go see one battle after another, pay for books in case the fine folks at Penguin Press didn't end up coming through on the arcs that they eventually give to us. You guys really are a huge engine that makes this show run, and we appreciate every single one of you. Until next episode, thank you all for listening.
Bye.
The
Bye!